For 3 years, I buried my wife. For 3 years, I believed it was an accident. And then tonight, at 3 a.m., my phone lit up in the dark with a single message. From her. From Elara. If you're reading this, then I'm already gone. It was not an accident. Look inside the safe, behind our wedding photo, and do not trust my sister, especially if she has already married you. I slowly turned my head. Beside me, hugging a pillow, sound asleep, was my new wife, her biological sister, Jocelyn. The moonlight fell across her face, soft and pale, and she looked exactly like the kind of woman you would trust with your life. I had trusted her with mine. For a full minute, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the phone screen until the light dimmed and clicked off on its own, and the words vanished as if they had never existed. But they had existed. I had read them. Elara's name glowing at the top of the message like a ghost climbing out of a grave. I am Caleb Hayes, 31 years old, and up until 3 a.m. tonight, I thought I was a widower who had finally, painfully, learned how to be happy again. Now I lay frozen in my own bed, my heart slamming against my ribs, doing the only thing a man in my situation could do. Pretending to still be asleep. Because if that message was real, if even one word of it was true, then the woman breathing gently beside me was not my grieving sister-in-law who had nursed me back from the edge of ruin. She was the person who had put my wife in a coffin. Let me back up. Let me tell you how a reasonable man ends up married to his dead wife's sister, because from the outside it looks insane, and from the inside it felt like the most natural thing in the world, which is exactly how the best traps are built. Elara Vance was the love of my life. That is not a line I use lightly. I met her when I had nothing, when I was a junior architect drowning in student debt, eating instant noodles in a rented room the size of a closet. She was the only daughter of the Vance family, heiress to one of the largest private conglomerates in the country, worth somewhere north of 40 billion, and by every law of how the world is supposed to work, she should never have looked twice at me. But she did. She walked into a design competition I had entered on a whim, looked at my model of a floating library, and said, "The person who dreamed this doesn't belong in a closet." 3 years later, we were married. Not a business marriage, not an alliance of titans, a real one, the kind her family openly disapproved of, the kind her younger sister Jocelyn watched with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I should have paid attention to that smile. I didn't. I was too busy being in love. Elara was warm in a way rich people almost never are, generous without keeping score, and terrifyingly sharp underneath all of it. She ran the Vance Group's real estate division by the time she was 26, and she ran it better than men twice her age who had been groomed for it their whole lives. People underestimated her because she was beautiful and because she laughed easily. That was their mistake, and as I would only understand 3 years too late, it was also the mistake that killed her. Jocelyn was 2 years younger. Same parents, same bloodline, and on paper the same everything. But where Elara was sunlight, Jocelyn was the reflection of sunlight off glass, bright, sharp, and cold if you touched it. She was the second daughter, the spare, the one whose name never appeared in the succession documents because the Vance patriarch, old grandfather Vance, had eyes and had made his choice long ago. Elara would inherit control. Jocelyn would inherit an allowance. I have gone back since and reread every memory I have of Jocelyn from before, the way you reread a letter after you learn the person who wrote it was lying, and the signs were all there, and I missed every one of them, because I was a decent man, and decent men are the easiest people in the world to fool. Let me give you just one memory, because it tells you everything about who Jocelyn was long before she became who she is now. It was my engagement party to Elara, years ago, the real engagement, the one the family disapproved of. Elara's parents were still alive then, and they did not want their heiress marrying a nobody architect with student debt, and the party was a tense, glittering, passive-aggressive affair, and I was miserable and trying to hide it, and the only person who was kind to me that whole night was Jocelyn. She found me on the balcony where I'd escaped to breathe, and she brought me a drink, and she stood with me in the cold, and she said, "They'll come around. You make her happy, and in the end, that's the only thing that beats money in this family, because we have so much money that happiness is the only thing left that's rare." And I was so grateful, so touched, that the difficult younger sister had crossed the room to comfort the outsider, and I remember thinking, everyone underestimates Jocelyn. She's kinder than she lets on. I told Elara that later, and Elara had gone very quiet, and then she'd said, "Jocelyn is never kind by accident, Caleb. If she was kind to you tonight, she was making a deposit. Someday she'll make a withdrawal, and you won't see it coming, because you'll have forgotten it was ever a loan." I thought that was cruel. I thought Elara was being unfair to her own sister. Now I understand that Elara had spent her entire life next to Jocelyn and had learned, the way you learn the weather, to read the exact color of the sky before the storm. That night on the balcony, Jocelyn wasn't comforting me. She was Instagram me. She was beginning, years early, the slow, patient work of being the one person in the family the outsider trusted, so that if the day ever came when she needed him, the trust would already be built, aged, seasoned, ready. She played a game that long. That's what I could never make the police fully understand, and what I want you to understand, because it's the most frightening thing about the whole story. Jocelyn did not decide to murder Elara and take me in a moment of passion or greed. Jocelyn had been laying track for years, keeping every option open, being kind to the right people, and patient with the right situations, so that when the moment came, when Elara found Meridian and gave her a week, the machine was already 3/4 built. The kindness on the balcony, the warmth at the funeral, the year of comfort. They were all the same substance, all deposits, all track, laid down long before there was a train, by a person who understood that the best way to control the future is to be owed things by everyone in it. And the reason it worked on me and on the board and on the whole watching world, is that Jocelyn understood something most people are too honest to use. She understood that being loved is a skill. Not being lovable, being loved, actively, the doing of it, the way you make another person feel seen and safe and chosen. And she had studied that skill the way other people study law or finance, coldly, deliberately, as a tool. And she was better at it than anyone I have ever met. Better at it, God help me, in some technical way, than Elara. Because Elara's warmth was real, and therefore had limits, and Jocelyn's was manufactured, and therefore had none. "I know how to be loved," she wrote in that text message, the one that ended up 40 feet tall on a screen. It was not a boast, it was a job description. Grandfather Vance saw it. I know that now too. When he rose out of his wheelchair at the gala and told her he'd seen this in her when she was small and prayed he was wrong, he was telling the truth. The old man had chosen Elara as his heir not because he loved her more, though he did, but because 70 years of reading men across negotiating tables had taught him to see the exact thing in Jocelyn that everyone else mistook for depth, the cold engine running behind the warm face, and he had made his choice to protect the company from it, and his choice had, in the cruelest possible irony, given Jocelyn her motive. He tried to cage the thing he saw, and the cage became the reason it killed. He carried that. He carried it to his grave. I used to feel a little sorry for Jocelyn about that. I actually did. I remember telling Elara once that we should include her more, that it wasn't fair she always seemed to be standing just outside the warm circle of the family, and Elara had looked at me for a long moment and said something I didn't understand at the time. She said, "Caleb, some people stand outside the circle because they're planning to burn it down and inherit the ashes." I laughed. I thought she was being dramatic. God help me, I laughed. The accident happened on a Tuesday in October. Elara was driving back alone from the coastal site where we were planning to build the floating library, the one from the competition, the dream that had started everything, because after all those years she had finally gotten the board to approve it, and she wanted to walk the cliffs alone at sunset before the machines came. Her car went off the coast road at the third hairpin turn, through the guardrail, and down 200 feet into the sea. They recovered the vehicle. They did not, for 11 days, recover her body, and when they finally did, there was so little left to identify that they asked me not to look. The official report said her brakes had failed on a wet road. Mechanical failure. Tragic. Unforeseeable. Nobody's fault. I remember the police officer who delivered the news, a tired man named Detective Delgado, kept watching my face in a way I found strange, like he was waiting for me to say something I didn't know I was supposed to say. I said nothing. I just fell apart, quietly, completely, the way you do when the center of your universe is deleted from existence between one sunset and the next. The funeral was enormous. Half the business world came to be seen mourning a Vance. Grandfather Vance sat in the front row like a statue carved out of grief and did not speak to anyone. And Jocelyn. Jocelyn held my arm the entire time. She caught me when my knees buckled at the graveside. She was the one who moved into the guest wing of our home in the weeks after. Just until you can stand on your own, Caleb, Elara would have wanted someone to look after you. She cooked when I forgot to eat. She sat with me at 4 a.m. when the nightmares came. She cried with me, and her tears looked exactly like grief, because I now understand that to a certain kind of person, tears are just another tool, no different from a wrench or a knife, something you pick up when the job requires it and put down when it doesn't. The company was in chaos after Elara died. Her division was leaderless. 40 billion in assets suddenly had a hole in the center of it, and Grandfather Vance was old and getting older, and there were vultures, so many vultures, circling the family. And through all of it, one person stayed steady at my side, guiding me, translating the incomprehensible legal and financial storm into something I could survive. Jocelyn. It took 18 months. That's how long the slow, patient current ran before it carried me exactly where it had been designed to carry me. People started saying at first, wasn't it beautiful how the two of them leaned on each other through the loss? Wasn't it fitting? Wasn't it what Elara would have wanted? The family staying whole, the grief becoming something gentler? Jocelyn never pushed. That was the genius of it. She never once made the first move. She simply made herself so essential, so woven into the fabric of my broken life, that one night, a little over a year ago, when she was crying about how empty the house felt and how she was so afraid of losing me too, I was the one who reached out. I was the one who said, maybe we didn't have to be so alone. I proposed to her. Me. And that, I understand now, was the entire point. A predator who forces the door leaves marks. A predator who makes you open it yourself leaves nothing at all. We married quietly, in deference to the memory of Elara, a small ceremony that the family framed as healing. Grandfather Vance did not attend. At the time, I told myself he was too frail. Now I wonder what the old man knew or suspected, and whether his absence was the only protest a dying king could afford to make. And so, for the last year, I have been the husband of Jocelyn Vance, and I have been, I thought, something close to content. Not the blazing happiness I had with Elara, something quieter. A second life built on the foundation of a buried one. I even started designing again. I even started to believe the worst was behind me. Which brings us back to 3 a.m., and the message from a dead woman, and the murderer sleeping 6 inches from my shoulder. I lay there in the dark, and I made myself think, really think, the way Elara used to when a deal was going sideways and everyone else was panicking. Panic is a luxury, she used to say. It's for people who aren't in danger yet. First question, was the message real? My hands wanted to grab the phone and check, verify, prove it to myself. I forced them still. If it was real, and if Jocelyn had any way of monitoring my phone, then the worst thing I could do was react. So I breathed slow. In for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the way you do to fool a polygraph. And I stared at the ceiling and I ran it through my mind again. The message had come from a number I didn't recognize, but the display name had been saved as S, just the letter. Elara used to sign her private notes to me that way, a single S, because she said her full name belonged to the company and the letter belonged to me. Nobody knew that. Nobody. Not her parents, not her assistant, not Jocelyn. It was ours. The kind of small, secret thing that 2 people share and no one can fake. Whoever sent that message either was Elara, which was impossible, or had access to something so private that only Elara could have set it up before she died. A delayed message, a dead man's switch, something scheduled to fire on a timer or triggered by a condition, sitting silent in some server for 3 years, waiting. And it had gone off tonight. Why tonight? That question sent a cold finger down my spine, because there was only one thing that had changed recently. One date on the horizon that mattered. In 11 days, the 3-year probate on Elara's estate would close, and the final tranche of her personal holdings, the assets that did not automatically revert to the Vance Group but were hers alone, her voting shares, her private trust, nearly $9 billion of it, would transfer permanently to her legal next of kin and spouse. To me. And by extension, through our marriage, to Jocelyn. 11 days. The message had waited 3 years and then detonated with 11 days to spare, as if Elara had known, somehow, that the danger would sharpen right at the finish line. I understood then, lying in that bed, that my wife had been smarter in death than everyone around her had been in life. She had not simply been murdered, she had seen it coming, and she had built a machine, and the machine had my hand in the dark 3 years later, pointing me at the truth. Beside me, Jocelyn stirred. My whole body went rigid. She rolled toward me, her arm draping across my chest, warm and heavy and familiar, and she murmured something in her sleep. My name. Caleb. Soft and trusting, and it took everything I had not to flinch away from her touch like it was a live wire. I made myself lie still under the arm of the woman I now suspected had killed the only person I had ever truly loved. I made myself breathe. And in the dark, staring at nothing, I made my first decision. I would not confront her. I would not. Call the police. Not yet. Not with a message that had already vanished and no evidence but a single letter of the alphabet. I would do what Elara would have done. I would say nothing. I would change nothing. I would smile at breakfast and kiss her cheek and go to work. And I would become, starting right now, the best actor in the world. Because somewhere in this house, behind our wedding photo, in a safe I had walked past 1,000 times, my dead wife had left me a weapon. And I was going to find it, and I was going to learn how to use it. And then, I was going to take everything from the people who took her. Every last dollar, every last day of freedom, everything. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. When the gray light of morning finally came, I had a plan, and I had a face ready to wear. And underneath it, where no one could see, I had something that hadn't been there in 3 years. I had a reason to be alive. Morning in our house followed a script, and that morning I performed it flawlessly. I woke, or pretended to, at 7 a.m. when Jocelyn's alarm chimed. I let her rise first, listened to the soft sounds of her routine, the shower, the drawers, the particular click of her heels she wore even at home because she liked the authority of the sound. Elara used to walk barefoot everywhere. Another difference I had trained myself not to notice. I came downstairs to find Jocelyn at the kitchen island in a cream silk robe, scrolling her tablet, a cup of black coffee steaming beside her. She looked up and smiled, and it was a beautiful smile, and a year ago it would have warmed me, and this morning it made the back of my neck crawl. "You slept badly," she said, not a question. My heart stumbled. Did she know? Had she seen the phone light up? I kept my face open, tired, ordinary. "Bad dreams," I said. "The site inspection's been stressing me out." "The library again." She set down her cup, and there was something in the way she said it, a flatness, that I had never let myself hear before. Elara's dream project, the floating library, the thing Elara had been driving to see the day she died, and I had insisted on reviving it after the wedding as a memorial, and Jocelyn had supported it, publicly, warmly. But now, listening with new ears, I heard the truth under her voice. She hated that project. She hated it the way you hate a witness. "You worked too hard on it," she said, softer now, sliding off the stool and crossing to me, wrapping her arms around my waist, tilting her face up. "Elara's gone, Caleb. You've built her a monument. At some point you have to let yourself live in the present, with me." And there it was, wrapped in tenderness, the same message the delayed text had warned me about. Let go of Elara. Stop looking backward. Live in the present I have arranged for you. I looked down at my wife's lovely upturned face, and I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I smiled, and I bent down, and I kissed her forehead, and I said, "You're right. You're always right." And I felt her relax against me, satisfied, reassured, the predator confirming the prey was still calm, and inside my own chest my heart was a fist of ice. "I have to go to the office early," I said. "Board's nervous about the probate closing. Lawyers everywhere." I watched her eyes when I said the word probate. Just a flicker, a tiny sharpening, gone in an instant, the look of someone hearing the sound of a finish line. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Do you want me to come? I can move my afternoon." "No," I said, too fast, then caught myself and softened it. "No, you have your gallery thing. I'll be buried in contracts all day. Boring." She studied me for a half-second longer than was comfortable. Then the smile returned, seamless. "Come home to me," she said. "Always," I lied. I got in my car. I drove out of the gates of the house that Elara's money had built and that Jocelyn now ruled. I drove 3 blocks, and then I pulled over on a quiet street, put the car in park, and sat there with my hands shaking on the wheel. Because now, finally, alone, I could take out my phone. The message was gone from the lock screen, but I opened the messaging app anyway, scrolling, praying. Nothing. No thread from S, no number. It had wiped itself. Of course it had. Elara would never have left something so fragile that a curious wife could find it in the morning. My stomach dropped. Had I imagined it? 3 years of grief, a bad night, a dream so vivid it felt real? For one horrible moment I doubted my own mind, and then my phone buzzed in my hand and I nearly dropped it. An email. New account, no name, subject line blank. I opened it. It was one line. "You went back to sleep. Good. That means you understood. Now go to the office, act normal, and tonight when she's out, open the safe. Everything you need is behind the photo. I'm sorry, my love. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. S. My eyes burned. My throat closed. Behind that cold, careful voice, I could hear her, the real her, the woman who planned 3 moves ahead and still, at the end of it, apologized to me for the crime of being murdered. Elara had known she was going to die. That was the thing that broke me, sitting in that car on that quiet street. Not that she was gone. I had lived with gone for 3 years. It was that she had known. That she had felt the danger closing around her, and instead of running, instead of screaming, she had gone quiet and built a machine to protect me and to punish them. And she had carried that secret all the way off a cliff so that I could keep living, oblivious, safe, for 3 whole years until the moment I needed to know. I wiped my face. I put the car in drive. And I made her a promise, out loud, alone, in a way I had never been able to make it at her grave, because at her grave, I hadn't known what I was promising. I'm going to finish it, I said. Whatever you started, I'm going to finish it. Then I drove to the office, and I walked in wearing the face of a grieving but healing widower turned remarried man, and I began, that very morning, to hunt. The Vance Group Tower stood 40 floors above the financial district, glass and steel, and I had an office on the 38th that I had never earned and never wanted. After Elara died and I married Jocelyn, the family had given me a title, Director of Special Projects, which is the kind of title you invent for a man you need to keep close but don't quite trust with anything real. My whole job was the library, Elara's monument. I understood now that they had kept me busy with a beautiful, harmless dream so that I would never look too closely at the machinery underneath. That morning I walked through the lobby nodding at people whose names I barely knew, and I felt like a man walking across a frozen lake, listening for the crack. Everyone was normal. The receptionist smiled. The elevator played its soft music. And all of it felt like a stage set now, every friendly face a possible enemy. Because if Jocelyn had done what Elara said she had done, she had not done it alone. You do not sabotage an heiress's car and stage a coastal accident and forge a mechanical report and control an 11-day probate window by yourself. You need money you don't officially have. You need people inside. You need a lawyer, an accountant, a mechanic, a cop maybe, and above all, you need a partner. Someone as cold as you are. Someone with a reason. I needed to find out who. But I couldn't go asking questions. The moment I started poking at the accident, at the estate, at Jocelyn, the whole trap would sense the pressure and close. I needed someone outside the Vance world entirely. And there was exactly one person on Earth I trusted that much. His name is Connor Shaw, but nobody has called him Connor since college. We call him Shaw, and back when I was eating instant noodles in a closet, he was in the next closet over. And while I was drawing buildings, he was taking apart networks. Shaw is the reason I passed statistics. Shaw is the reason my first firm didn't get its client database stolen. Shaw now runs a small, expensive, extremely discreet cybersecurity consultancy, the kind that corporations hire when they've been breached and would rather die than admit it publicly. If there was a digital thread anywhere in this, Shaw could pull it. And Shaw had never liked Jocelyn. I remember at my second wedding, the small, quiet one, Shaw had stood at the back with a drink he didn't touch, and afterward he'd said only one thing to me. He'd said, "You sure, brother?" And I'd been annoyed, and now, 3 years later, that one sentence rang in my head like a bell. I texted him from my office, from my personal phone, and I kept it casual in case anyone was ever reading it. "Drinks tonight? Been too long." His reply came in 90 seconds. "Thought you'd never ask. The usual, 8. The usual was a loud, cheap, crowded bar on the east side, exactly the kind of place where 2 men could talk under music and no directional microphone in the world could pick them apart. Shaw had chosen it on purpose years ago, back when we were young and paranoid for fun. Now I was paranoid for my life. I spent the day performing. I sat in a meeting about the library's foundation permits, and I nodded, and I signed, and I heard nothing. I ate lunch with a junior engineer who idolized me, and I smiled at his enthusiasm. And in the back of my mind, always, was the safe. Our house had a safe in the study, behind a large framed photograph from my first wedding, from my wedding to Elara. It was a beautiful photo, the 2 of us on the cliffs, the same coast where she would later die. And after she was gone, I had never been able to take it down even after I married Jocelyn, and Jocelyn had never asked me to, and I had thought that was generosity. Now I understood it differently. Jocelyn left that photo up because it never once occurred to her that it was dangerous. She had walked past the evidence of her own crime every single day for a year, secure in the knowledge that dead women don't talk. Elara, it turned out, had counted on exactly that arrogance. I got home at 6:30. Jocelyn was still out at her gallery event, some sculptor she was patronizing. Back by 9, she'd texted, with a heart. I had until 9. I did not go straight to the study. I made myself get a glass of water first, walk the ground floor, check that the housekeeper had gone home, that the gardener's truck was gone, that I was alone. Then I went into the study, and I closed the door, and I stood in front of the photograph of my dead wife and me smiling on the cliff, and my hands were steady now, because grief had turned into something with a spine. I lifted the frame off its hook. Behind it was the safe, a small, heavy wall unit with a keypad. And here was the first test, because I did not know the combination. Jocelyn had set it after we married, for our documents, and she kept the code, and if I had to guess, I would have exactly a few tries before it locked and alerted her phone. I stood there with the frame in my hands, and I turned it over, some instinct making me look at the back of the photo itself, and taped to the inside of the frame's backing board, where it had sat hidden behind the picture for 3 years, was a small, folded square of paper. Elara's handwriting. 6 digits, and beneath them, 4 words. Our first, plus mine. I almost laughed. Our first. The date we met, the design competition, plus mine, her birthday. Elara had not given me the code to Jocelyn's safe. She had given me the code to a safe that did not exist yet, trusting that whoever eventually installed one, whatever the year, she could not predict, but that if I ever lifted this frame and needed in, the numbers waiting there were a message. This is where I hid things from your future. It made no sense, and it made perfect sense, and only later, when I understood the whole machine, did I see that the safe combination Jocelyn chose and the numbers Elara left were never meant to match. The note wasn't the code to Jocelyn's safe. It was a key to something else entirely, and the safe was just the first door. But I didn't know that yet, so I tried it. Our first, plus mine, 6 digits. I keyed them in with my heart in my throat, and the little light on the keypad blinked red. Wrong. My stomach lurched. One wrong try. I stood there sweating, and then I did what Elara would have wanted me to do, which was stop being an idiot and think. She wrote, our first, plus mine. Not the digits I assumed. Our first could be the competition date, yes, but to Elara, our first had always meant something more specific. A private joke, the first night we spent together, not the competition, a different date entirely, one only I would know, one no sister could ever guess. I keyed in the real numbers. The keypad blinked green. The safe clicked open. And I understood, with a chill, that Elara had built even the combination as a lock only I could open, a test to make sure that if this safe were ever cracked, it would be cracked by the one man on Earth who had shared that particular night with her and no one else. Inside the safe were Jocelyn's things, boring things, our marriage certificate, property deeds, a velvet box of jewelry, some cash, and underneath all of it, at the very bottom, flat against the steel floor, was a slim, padded envelope, unmarked, that did not belong to Jocelyn at all, because Jocelyn did not know it was there, because Elara had not hidden it in this safe. She had hidden it in the wall cavity behind where any future safe would inevitably be installed, in the only truly private space in a house full of watchers, and the newer safe had simply been bolted in over the top of it, sealing her secret in deeper. I had to reach past the false floor, into the gap Elara had cut and replastered herself in the weeks before she died, and my fingers closed on it, and I pulled it out. My hands were not steady anymore. Inside the envelope were 3 things. A cheap prepaid phone, the burner kind, dead, with a charging cable coiled around it. A USB drive. And a letter, handwritten, on the cream stationery Elara used for the notes she signed with a single S. I sat down on the floor of the study, my back against the desk, and I read my dead wife's letter. And outside the window the sky went from gold to gray to dark. Caleb, it began. If you are reading this, then the message reached you, which means 3 years have passed, and I am dead, and worse than dead, I am dead and you married her, because I built the trigger to fire only if that happened. I'm sorry. I am so sorry to reach into your life like a ghost and tear the peace out of it. But you have to know, and more than that, you have to be careful, because the danger is not over. In fact, if you are reading this, the danger is just beginning, because she has almost everything now, and there is only one thing left standing between Jocelyn and the last of my fortune. You. Let me tell you what I know, and how I know it, and what I could not prove in time. 6 months before I wrote this, I found a hole in the division's accounts. Small at first. A vendor that didn't quite exist. A consulting fee to a shell company. I traced it, because that's what I do, and the money was flowing out of Vance Real Estate and into an offshore structure I couldn't see the bottom of, and when I finally got a name on the beneficial owner, it was a company controlled by a man named Gavin Thorne. You've met him, once, at the Spring Gala. Tall, charming, the investor everyone wanted a photo with. What you don't know is that Gavin Thorne has been my sister's lover for 4 years. Since before your wedding. Since before mine. They have been together in secret the entire time, and together they have been bleeding my division for capital, and I was about to expose it. And I made the fatal mistake, of telling Jocelyn first. Family first, I thought. Give her a chance to explain, to come clean, before I destroy her. I sat her down, and I told her I knew everything, and I gave her a week to make it right. That was my mistake. That was the mistake that's going to kill me, because I can see it now in how she's watching me, in the too careful way she asks about my schedule, in the fact that my car came back from service last week, and the brakes feel wrong, and the mechanic swears they're fine. I'm being hunted, Caleb, in my own family, and I can't prove it yet. And if I go to the police with an accusation against Vance with no evidence, I'll be the hysterical heiress and she'll be the wronged sister, and Gavin has money and lawyers and reach I'm only beginning to map. So I'm doing the only thing I can. I'm building a case she can't wave away, and I'm hiding it where only you can find it, and I'm setting a trigger, and I am praying that I finish before she does. If you're reading this, I didn't. On the USB is everything I gathered, the account traces, the shell companies, photos of Jocelyn and Gavin that leave no doubt, and the phone. The phone is the most important thing. Charge it and you'll understand. Don't trust anyone inside the company until you know where the money touched them, because money is how she buys people, and she has been buying for years. Trust the old man. Trust my grandfather. Whatever else he is, he loves this family more than he loves himself, and he will not have known, because if he had known, he would have burned the world down. And Caleb, my love, finish it. Not for the money. I don't care about the money, I never did. Finish it because I was murdered for seeing the truth, and the truth deserves a witness who lives. Finish it, and then, please, let me go. Be happy. Actually be happy, not the performance of it. That's the last thing I'll ever ask you for. Mara S. I don't know how long I sat on that floor. When I finally moved, the room was fully dark and my face was wet, and my hands had stopped shaking because something in me had gone very cold and very still, the way the sea goes still right before the tide turns. Gavin Thorne. 4 years. My wedding. Her wedding. A shell company. Brakes that came back wrong from a service. A week's warning that had been a death sentence. I looked at the burner phone in my hand and the USB drive, and I heard, faintly, the sound of the front gate. Headlights swept across the study window. Jocelyn was home early. It was 8:40. Shaw was waiting for me across the city at a loud bar with a drink he wouldn't touch, and my murdered wife's entire case was in my 2 hands, and my wife's murderer was walking up the front path, and I had maybe 90 seconds. I moved. I put the marriage certificate and the deeds in the jewelry box back exactly as they had been, in the exact order, because a woman who plans a murder for months notices when a velvet box is turned the wrong way. I closed the safe. I spun the lock. I lifted the framed photo of Elara and me on the cliffs, and I hung it back on its hook, straight, level, and I slid the burner phone and the USB and the letter into the inside pocket of my jacket, against my chest, over my heart, and I was stepping out of the study and pulling the door shut behind me, just as I heard Jocelyn's key in the front door. Caleb? Her voice called, bright, musical. I came home early. The sculpture was insufferable. I came down the hall toward her with a glass of whiskey in my hand that I had grabbed off the sideboard as a prop, and I smiled and I said, "Perfect timing. I was about to drink alone and feel sorry for myself." And she laughed and she came to me and she kissed me, and I kissed her back, my dead wife's confession pressed against my chest under my jacket, close enough that if Jocelyn had leaned in an inch more, she might have felt the hard edge of the USB drive over my heart. "You smell like whiskey and stress," she murmured against my mouth. "I actually have to go back out," I said, easy, rueful. "Shaw's in town. He's already at the bar. I forgot completely. I'm a terrible friend." Something crossed her face, just a flicker, at the name Shaw. She had never liked him either, and now I understood that of course she hadn't, because Jocelyn was smart, and smart predators always recognize the one guest at the wedding who looks at them a half-second too long. "Connor Shaw," she said, and she smiled, and the smile was flawless. "Have fun with your little hacker. Don't come home too drunk." "Never," I said, and I kissed her forehead, and I walked out the door and down the path to my car with my hands in my pockets so she wouldn't see them, and I did not let myself run, and I did not let myself look back at the woman standing in the golden doorway of the house that my dead wife's money had built, watching me go with her arms crossed and her head tilted, already, I would later learn, beginning to wonder. On the drive across the city to meet Shaw, With Elara's letter and the burner phone and the USB pressed against my chest, I did something I had not let myself do in 3 years. I let myself remember the funeral. Not the fog of it, the fog I'd lived in, but the specific things, the details my grief had smeared over, and I looked at each one again with the new, terrible clarity the letter had given me. I remembered Jocelyn holding my arm at the graveside. I had thought, for 3 years, that she was holding me up. Now I understood she was holding me in place, positioning the grieving widower exactly where the cameras and the family could see him being tenderly supported by the devoted sister, laying the very first foot of track for the year to come. I remembered how she had cried, and how her tears had looked exactly like mine, and I understood now that they were not the same substance at all, that mine came from a wound, and hers came from a decision. I remembered that she had been the one to suggest, gently, weeks later, that I shouldn't be alone in that big house, that she'd move into the guest wing just until I could stand. I remembered that she had been the one to handle the paperwork, the estate, the company chaos, translating the incomprehensible storm into something I could survive. And I saw now that every document she'd walked me through, every form she'd handed me to sign in my fog, had been a hand on the wheel, steering, always steering, toward the marriage and the transfer and the boat. And I remembered one thing that had never made sense until that drive. A small thing, the kind of thing grief files away without examining. At the funeral, Detective Delgado had come up to me, the tired cop, and he'd said he was sorry for my loss. And then he'd said, watching my face, "If anything ever occurs to you, anything at all about that day, you call me." And he'd pressed his card into my hand, and Jocelyn had appeared at my elbow, out of nowhere, smooth and quick, and taken the card and said, "I'll keep this safe for him, Detective, he's not himself," and slipped it into her own bag, and Delgado had watched her do it with a flat, unreadable expression, and I had thought nothing of it. 3 years later, driving across the city, I understood that I had watched, at my own wife's funeral, the murderer intercept the one lifeline the honest cop tried to throw me, and I had felt grateful for her efficiency. That memory, more than the letter, more than the phone, was the one that set the cold all the way into my bones, because it showed me how total it had been, how early, how complete. She had been managing me from the graveside, and the honest cop had seen it happen and been powerless to say anything, and had gone home and carried it for 3 years. The same 3 years I carried my fog, both of us circling the same buried truth from opposite sides, waiting for a door that only a dead woman's message could finally open. The bar was exactly as loud and exactly as ugly as I needed it to be. Shaw was at the back, in the corner booth with a wall behind him, because Shaw always sits with a wall behind him, a habit from a life spent assuming someone is watching. He's a big man now, bigger than in college, with a shaved head and a beard going gray and eyes that miss nothing. He took one look at my face as I slid into the booth, and he stopped smiling. "Okay," he said quietly under the music. "You didn't come here for drinks. What happened?" I put the burner phone and the USB drive on the table between us, under the cover of my hand. "I need you to tell me I'm not crazy," I said. "And then I need you to help me put 2 people in prison for the rest of their lives." Shaw looked at the phone. He looked at the USB. He looked at me for a long, long moment, and then he did something I'll never forget. He reached across the table and gripped my forearm, hard, the way you grab a man who's standing too close to an edge, and he said, 3 years. 3 years I've watched you sleepwalk through a life that felt wrong, and I couldn't say anything because you seemed to need it. If you're telling me what I think you're telling me, then you say the word, and I am all the way in, no questions, no limits, until it's finished. Now start at the beginning and don't leave anything out." So I told him. The 3 a.m. message, the email, the safe, the letter, Gavin Thorne, the breaks, the 11 days. And as I talked, I watched my old friend's face change, watched the horror move through it, and then harden into the same cold stillness that had settled into my own chest. And by the time I finished, he had ordered us both black coffee instead of alcohol, because we were working now, and Shaw does not drink when he works. "Give me the phone first," he said. He pulled a small battery pack and a fistful of cables out of his jacket, because of course he did, and he found the right one and plugged in the dead burner and set it face down on the table to charge while he took the USB and slid it into a slim laptop he'd produced from his bag. "This is going straight onto an air-gapped machine," he said. "Nothing touches a network. If Elara was as careful as you say, she'll have encrypted it, and if she encrypted it for you, there'll be a key only you'd know." He was right. The USB opened to a single locked archive, and the password hint was one word on the screen. Closet. I almost lost it right there in the booth. The closet. The room the size of a closet where I'd been living when she met me, where she'd said the person who dreamed the floating library didn't belong. Our whole beginning in one word. I typed the address of that old rented room, the one I'd never told anyone about, and the archive opened like a flower. Folders, dozens of them, spreadsheets, scans, photographs, audio files, a whole architecture of proof built by a woman who knew she was running out of time. Shaw started at the top and worked down with the focus of a surgeon, and I sat beside him and watched my dead wife's investigation unfold. And it was, even in that grief, a beautiful thing. Because Elara had been so good at this, so relentless, so smart. The money first. Shaw traced it across the screen with a finger. Okay, here. Vance Real Estate pays a vendor called Meridian Advisory for consulting. 11 payments over 18 months, escalating, total just under 60 million. Meridian Advisory has no website, no staff, one registered address that's a mail drop. Elara did the work already. Look, she followed the ownership up through 3 shells, Meridian to Coastline Holdings, to a trust in a jurisdiction that doesn't share records. And then she got lucky or got a source. Because here's the beneficial owner document, and the name on it is Gavin Thorne. He looked up at me. $60 million siphoned out of the division Elara ran into a company owned by her sister's secret boyfriend. That's not an affair, Caleb. That's a joint criminal enterprise with a body count. Keep going, I said. The photographs next. Jocelyn and Gavin. Dozens of them, time-stamped, going back 4 years as Elara's letter had said, and they told a story with no ambiguity in it at all. A hotel in another city. A private dinner in a corner booth much like the one we were sitting in. The 2 of them at an airport, her head on his shoulder. And the one that hollowed me out. The 2 of them at a party I recognized, because I was in the background of the photograph, out of focus, laughing with someone, my Wedding to Elara band on my hand. And there in the foreground, Jocelyn was leaning up to whisper something in Gavin Thorne's ear while she watched me over his shoulder. 4 years. She had stood in my life for 4 years, at my wedding to her sister, at my dinner table, at Elara's funeral holding my arm, and the whole time there had been this. The audio, Shaw said, and his voice had changed. Caleb, you need to hear the audio. There were 3 files. Elara had recorded them in the last weeks of her life, and hearing her voice come out of that little laptop speaker in that loud bar was like being touched by a hand from underground. The first was a recording of the phone call she described in her letter, the fatal one, where she confronted Jocelyn. And there it was, the whole thing, Elara's voice steady and heartbroken saying, I know about Meridian, Jocelyn. I know about Gavin. I know all of it, and I'm giving you 1 week to come to grandfather with me and make it right before I take it to the board. And Jocelyn's voice, and God, Jocelyn's voice, so warm, so wounded. Elara, you have it all wrong. Let me explain. Please, just give me time. Don't do anything. Don't tell anyone. Promise me you won't tell anyone until we talk. Don't tell anyone. She'd bought herself the silence she needed to plan. The second recording was worse. It was shorter. It was Elara alone talking to the phone, to me, dated 4 days before she died, and her voice was tired and frightened in a way I had never once heard from her in life, because she never let me see fear. And she said, my brakes are wrong. I took it back and they swore they were fine, and I looked at the service record and there's a name on it I don't recognize, a mechanic who doesn't work there according to the front desk, and when I asked, the manager got nervous. I'm not imagining this. I'm going to stop driving that car. I'm going to tell Caleb everything this weekend. I can't carry it alone anymore. She never got the weekend. She died on a Tuesday. The third recording had no voice at all. It was 40 seconds of silence, and then the sound of an engine, and Shaw went very still and said, that's a dashcam audio file. She must have had a cabin recorder. This is... And I said, turn it off, because I knew what it was. I knew it was the last 40 seconds, and I could not. I could not listen to the sound of the sea coming up to meet her. Shaw turned it off. He sat back. Around us the bar roared on, oblivious, people laughing, glasses clinking, a whole world that didn't know that in the corner booth, 2 men were sitting with the recorded evidence of a murder glowing on a screen between them. The phone's charged, Shaw said quietly. He picked up the burner, pressed the power button, and it lit up, and it asked for a PIN. 4 digits. I didn't even have to think. I keyed in the day we met. It unlocked. There was one thing on that phone. One thread of text messages between the burner and another number, and I read them and the floor dropped out of the world. Because the burner phone had not belonged to Elara. Elara had stolen it, or copied it, or somehow obtained it, and the messages on it were between Jocelyn and Gavin in the days around Elara's death, and they were not careful because they thought no one would ever see them, and they were the whole confession in 20 lines. Gavin, is it done with the car? Jocelyn, A. Says it'll read as a failure. Wet road tomorrow. Perfect timing. Gavin. You're sure she doesn't know it's us? Jocelyn. She thinks I'm going to confess. She's giving me a week. Sweet, stupid Elara. She always did think the family came first. Gavin. After. 6 months minimum before we touch the accounts again. And the husband? Jocelyn. The husband is a golden retriever. When she's gone, he'll fall apart, and I'll be the one who catches him. Give it a year. I'll have the whole thing, the shares, the trust, all of it, and a grieving widower on a leash. Trust me, I know how to be loved. I read it twice. I read it a third time. I know how to be loved. Shaw was watching me. Caleb, he said carefully, breathe. I'm breathing, I said, and my voice came out of me flat and strange and calm, the calm of the sea before the tide turns, and I understood in that moment that something in me had finished breaking and started to set, like concrete, like a foundation. She planned it before Elara even confronted her. Read it again. Is it done with the car? That's before the accident. That's premeditated. That's the two of them deciding to murder her, and then, in the same breath, deciding to take me. I was part of the plan. The grieving widower on a leash. That was always the plan. The whole marriage, the whole year. She was never comforting me, Shaw. She was installing me. I'm not her husband. I'm the last lock on the vault. Shaw closed the laptop. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said the thing that decided everything. You have enough here to go to the police tonight, he said. The messages, the money, the audio, it's not clean, some of it's stolen. A defense lawyer will fight the burner's chain of custody, but it's enough to open a real investigation, enough that with the right detective, it ends with both of them in a cell. You could end it tonight. So I have to ask you, brother, before we go 1 inch further, do you want justice, or do you want to take everything from her the way she took everything from you? Because those are two different roads, and they don't look the same. And once we start down the second one, I'm not sure either of us comes back the way we went in. I thought about Elara's letter. Finish it, not for the money. Finish it because I was murdered for seeing the truth, and the truth deserves a witness who lives. And I thought about the messages. The golden retriever, the leash, I know how to be loved. And I thought about 11 days, and $9 billion about to complete its journey into the hands of the woman who had killed my wife to get it. And I made my choice, and it was not the clean one, and I have never once regretted it. Both, I said. I want both. I want her to lose everything first, in front of everyone, publicly, the money and the man and the name and the mask, all of it stripped off her while she watches, and then I want the law to take what's left. I want her to feel, for one night, exactly what Elara felt in that car. The moment you understand the person you trusted has already decided you're going to die. Shaw nodded slowly. He didn't argue. That's the thing about Shaw. He'd already known what I'd choose. He'd known before I did. Then we do it right, he said, and we do it cold, and we do not make a single move that we can't take back. And rule 1, starting right now, you go home tonight and you kiss her goodnight, and you are the same golden retriever you were yesterday. Because the only advantage we have, the only one, is that she doesn't know that you know. The second she suspects, she accelerates, and a woman who murders on a timeline murders faster when she's scared. You've got 11 days of being the happiest, dumbest, most in-love idiot husband in the world. Can you do that? Can you sleep next to her and smile at her and let her think she's won? For 11 more days? I thought about lying in the dark that morning, Jocelyn's arm across my chest, her voice murmuring my name in her sleep. I thought about how I hadn't flinched. I already did it once, I said. I can do it 11 more times. Then here's what happens next, Shaw said, and he leaned in, and under the roar of that ugly, beautiful bar, my dead wife's best weapon and my oldest friend laid out the first 3 moves of a plan that would take everything from Jocelyn Vance and give her, in the end, exactly what she had given Elara. Nothing. The 3 moves were simple to say and terrifying to live. Move 1. Verify the old man and bring him in, because a war against a Vance needs a Vance, and the patriarch was the only weapon in the family that Jocelyn couldn't override or outrank. Move 2. Build a clean parallel case with an honest cop, so that everything the stolen evidence had shown us could be rediscovered legally and survive a courtroom, because Shaw was immovable on this. Humiliation is a firework, Caleb. It's bright and it's over. Prison is a building. We're building a building. Move 3. And this was the one that made my stomach turn even as I agreed to it. Do absolutely nothing to change my daily life. Maintain the marriage, maintain the smile, maintain the leash. Because the single asset we possessed that money couldn't buy and Maxwell couldn't detect was Jocelyn's certainty that she had already won. The day she stops being certain, Shaw said, is the day she gets fast. And a fast predator on a $9 billion timeline doesn't wait 6 months. She improvises, and improvisation is how you end up dead. Your job, your only job, the hardest acting job any human being has ever been handed, is to be so completely the man she thinks she owns that she never once, not for a single second, suspects the man she actually married. You have to lose to her every day, on purpose, convincingly, joyfully, right up until the one day you win all at once. And I sat in that booth, and I thought about going home that night to sleep beside her, and every night after, for as long as it took, kissing her, making her coffee, being her golden retriever, while underneath I dismantled her, and I understood that Shaw was asking me to do the single most unnatural thing a betrayed man can do, which is to swallow the betrayal whole, every day, and smile. And I understood that Elara had asked me the same thing without words, by building a trap that only sprang if I could keep pretending. And I looked at my oldest friend and I said, I can do it. And Shaw looked back at me, and he did not say good, or I know. He said, it's going to cost you something to do it, brother. Wearing that face every day, next to her, it's going to take something out of you that you might not get back. I need you to know that going in. We're going to win, and it's going to leave a mark, and the mark is the price, and I'll be here after to help you carry it. But there's a price, and I won't let you pretend there isn't. That was the truest thing anyone said to me in the whole ordeal, and it turned out to be exactly right, because there was a price, and I did pay it, and the years of therapy and the long climb back to being a person were the installments, and I'd pay it again without a second's hesitation. But Shaw was the only one who told me, before I started, that I would be paying it all. That's what the oldest friends are for. Not to make it painless, to make sure you go in with your eyes open. We stayed until the bar closed. When I finally drove home, it was past 1 a.m., and I had the burner and the USB in a magnetic case Shaw had stuck under the frame of my own car where no one would look, and I had a copy of everything on 3 encrypted drives in 3 separate places, because Shaw does not believe in single points of failure. The house was dark. I let myself in quietly, and upstairs, in our bedroom, Jocelyn was awake, sitting up against the headboard in the lamplight, waiting for me, and my heart stopped for 1 full second before I got my face under. Control. You're up, I said. You were out late, she said, and she smiled and she patted the bed beside her. Come here, tell me about your night, tell me everything. Come here, tell me everything. 2 sentences, gently spoken, and every hair on my body stood up, because I have replayed Elara's audio enough now to know what Jocelyn sounds like when she's fishing. She was doing to me exactly what she'd done to Elara on that call. Keep them talking, find out what they know, smile while you do it. I crossed the room and I sat on the edge of the bed and I started to unbutton my shirt, ordinary, tired, a husband home late, and I gave her a night. Not the real night, a night. Shaw's getting divorced, I said, which was a lie I had prepared in the car, because a lie needs to be sad enough to explain a man coming home at 1 a.m. with red eyes. His wife's been seeing someone for 2 years. He just found out he's a wreck. I sat there and let him get drunk and tell me the whole thing 3 times. I rubbed my face. It's ugly, Jocelyn. Watching a marriage that looked perfect turn out to be a lie the whole time makes you feel like you can't trust anything. And I watched her in the lamplight, watched for the flicker, and there it was, the tiniest tightening at the corner of her eyes, at the words, a marriage that looked perfect turn out to be a lie. And then it was gone, and she made a sympathetic sound, and reached out and pulled me down against her. Poor Connor, she murmured into my hair, stroking it, soothing me, the murderer comforting her mark. Some people just aren't built to be faithful. It's sad. But it's not us, Caleb. Look at me. It's not us. It's not us, I agreed, my face against her shoulder so she couldn't see it. And I lay there in the arms of the woman who had ordered my wife's brakes cut, and I let her hold me, and I made myself go loose and heavy and warm, the golden retriever, home at last, safe at last. And after a while, her hands slowed in my hair, and her breathing deepened, and she slept. I did not. I lay awake in the dark for the 2nd night in a row, staring at the ceiling, and I thought about the 11 days, which were now 10, and I planned. In the morning, I was cheerful. I made her coffee. I complained about my back and the library permits. I was so aggressively normal that by the time I left for the office, I could see her relaxing, could see the suspicion I'd stirred up settling back down under the surface, and I understood the rhythm of the thing I was going to have to do for the next 10 days. Stir nothing. Be dull. Be safe. Be the leash she thought she was holding. The first move Shaw and I had agreed on was the old man, Grandfather Vance. Elara's letter had said trust him, he won't have known, and if he'd known, he'd have burned the world down. And everything in me wanted to believe it. But Shaw had a rule about wanting to believe things. "We verify the old man before we hand him a single fact," he'd said. "You loved Elara, and Elara loved her grandfather, and that's a reason to hope, not a reason to trust. First I check where the money touched him. If Meridian ever paid $1 toward anything with his fingerprints on it, he's compromised, and we route around him." So for 2 days, Shaw dug, quietly, into the offshore structure Elara had mapped, following the 60 million as it moved. And on the evening of the second day, he called me on a clean phone he'd given me, a phone Jocelyn didn't know existed, that lived in the magnetic case under my car and only came out when I was alone. "The old man's clean," Shaw said. "Better than clean. I found something." 8 months before Elara died, someone inside the company ran a quiet internal audit on Vance Real Estate. Very quiet, buried under a routine compliance review so nobody would notice. It got killed after 3 weeks, shut down from above, access revoked, the auditor reassigned to a branch office in another city. Guess who ordered the audit? "Elara?" I said. "No," said Shaw. "Grandfather Vance. 8 months before she died, the old man smelled something wrong in that division and started quietly pulling the thread himself, and someone with enough power made it disappear and exiled his auditor. He didn't know what he'd found, but he knew he'd found something. And then his granddaughter died in an accident, and I would bet you everything I own that old man has spent 3 years sitting in that mansion with a suspicion he can't prove and no one he can trust, going quietly out of his mind." I closed my eyes. Elara had been right. The old king had known there was rot in the walls, and it had cost him the one grandchild who could have helped him find it, and he'd been alone with it ever since, surrounded by a family he could no longer be sure of. "I need to see him," I said. "Alone, without Jocelyn knowing." "That," said Shaw, "is the hard part. Because you don't get to Grandfather Vance without going through the household, and the household reports to the family, and the family is her. If you request a private meeting with the old man, she hears about it within the hour, and a private meeting between the widower son-in-law and the patriarch 10 days before probate closes is exactly the kind of thing that makes a careful murderer nervous." He was right. I couldn't walk up to the front door. I needed a reason, a cover, something so natural that even Jocelyn's suspicion would find nothing in it. And it came to me that night, at dinner, from Jocelyn herself, because the best covers are always the ones your enemy hands you. "The library," she said over dinner, pushing food around her plate. "The dedication's coming up, isn't it? The 3-year memorial. Grandfather asked about it." I kept my face still. "He did?" "He wants it done properly," she said, and there was that flatness again under her voice, the way she always sounded when Elara's monument came up. "You know how he is about appearances. The family, united, honoring her. He wants to approve the dedication plaque personally. I told him you'd handle it." And there it was, my reason, gift-wrapped. The 3-year memorial dedication of Elara's floating library. The plaque, the family honoring her, and the patriarch wanting to personally approve it. Of course, the grieving husband would go and sit with the grieving grandfather to plan how they would honor their dead girl. Of course he would. Nothing could be more natural. Nothing could be more invisible. "I'll set up a meeting with him," I said, casual, buttering bread. "Get it right." Elara would want it perfect. And I felt Jocelyn watch me for a moment, and then relax, because I had just used Elara's name to volunteer for a task she found tedious, exactly as her golden retriever should. She had no idea she'd just opened the door to the one room in the world she most needed me to stay out of. I met the old man 3 days before probate closed. Grandfather Vance received me in his study, a vast, dim room full of books and shadows and the smell of old paper, and he had aged a decade in the 3 years since I'd really looked at him. He was a big man collapsed inward, his hands mottled and trembling slightly on the head of his cane, but his eyes, when they came up to meet mine, were not old at all. They were sharp and black and grieving and furious, the eyes of a king who had lost his heir and never once believed the story he'd been told about how. We were not alone at first. A household aide hovered, and a nurse, and I understood these were Jocelyn's eyes and ears, so I sat and I talked about the plaque, about the dedication, about bronze finishes and inscription fonts, and the old man played his part, gruff and particular, and it was all theater. And then, 20 minutes in, he set down his teacup with a sharp click and said, without looking up, "Leave us, all of you. I want to speak to my granddaughter's husband about her mother's favorite hymn, and I'll not have it turned into gossip in the kitchen." The aide hesitated. "Sir, Miss Jocelyn asked that." "Miss Jocelyn," said the old man, and his voice was suddenly the voice of the man who had built a $40 billion empire out of nothing. Does not run this house until I am in the ground, and I am not in the ground yet, though God knows there are those who'd like to hurry me. Out! They went. The door closed, and for a moment the old man and I sat in the dim study in silence, two men who had loved the same woman and lost her. And then Grandfather Vance leaned forward on his cane and looked at me with those black, burning eyes and said, very quietly, "You didn't come here about a plaque. I've watched you for 3 years, boy, sleepwalking through the coffin you crawled into, and today you walked in with your spine back. Something's changed in you. So I'll ask you once, and I'll know if you lie, because I've spent 70 years watching men lie to me. Why are you really here?" I looked at Elara's grandfather. I thought about Shaw's rule, verify before you hand over a single fact. But Shaw had verified. The old man was clean. The old man had smelled the rot 8 months before it killed her, and Elara, who had trusted almost no one, had trusted him. So I reached into my jacket, and I took out the clean phone, and I found the audio file, the first one, the confrontation, and I set it on the desk between us, and I said, "I need you to listen to something, and I need you to not make a sound while it plays, because there are people in this house who cannot know that you've heard it. It's Elara. It was recorded 3 weeks before she died." The old man's face did something terrible, and I pressed play, and Elara's voice filled the dim study, steady and heartbroken. "I know about Meridian, Jocelyn. I know about Gavin. I know all of it." And I watched Grandfather Vance's knuckles go white on the head of his cane, and I watched 3 years of unprovable suspicion turn, in real time, into certainty, and I watched something wake up in that ruined old giant that I can only describe as the return of a will that had been waiting 3 years for a reason to live. When it ended, he did not make a sound, as I'd asked. He sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then a single tear tracked down through the deep lines of his face, and he wiped it away with the back of one trembling hand. And when he spoke, his voice was terrible and steady. "Tell me everything," said Grandfather Vance. "And then, boy, you and I are going to take my company back from the thing that murdered my granddaughter. And when we are finished, she is going to have nothing. Not the money, not the name, not the daylight. Nothing." I told him everything. The 3 a.m. message, the safe, the letter, the 60 million through Meridian, the 4 years of photographs, the burner phone with its 20 lines of confession, the golden retriever on a leash. And the old man listened without interrupting. And when I got to the part about the brakes, about the service record with a mechanic's name that didn't belong, his head came up sharply. "Maxwell," he said. "The name on the record. Was it Maxwell?" I stared at him. "The messages just call him A. How do you—" "Because when my quiet audit got killed 8 months before she died," said Grandfather Vance, "the man who signed the order that shut it down and exiled my auditor was our head of corporate security, a man named Arthur Maxwell, Gavin Thorne's man. I could never prove the connection, but I felt it, the way you feel a draft from a door you can't see. Maxwell has run security for this family for 6 years, which means Maxwell knows where every camera is, which means Maxwell can make a camera not see a thing. And Maxwell, boy, has a brother who owns the service garage where all the family cars are maintained." The room went very cold. It clicked into place with an almost physical sound. A was not just the man who cut the brakes. A was Arthur Maxwell, the head of the family's own security, the man whose entire job was to protect the Sterlings, who had instead spent 6 years as the third leg of the stool. Jocelyn with the bloodline and the access, Gavin with the money and the shells, and Maxwell with the cameras and the mechanics and the ability to make an inconvenient granddaughter's death read as a wet road accident and then to make sure no investigation ever got traction. 3 of them, not 2. And the third one was the man I would have to get past to do anything at all, because Arthur Maxwell controlled the security of every building, every gate, every camera in the entire Vance world, including the one at my own front door. I called Shaw that night from the car and told him about Maxwell, and there was a long silence on the line, and then he said something that turned my blood to ice water. "That changes the threat model completely," he said. "Caleb, listen to me carefully. If Maxwell is in it, then Maxwell has probably been watching you for 3 years professionally, and the only reason he hasn't seen you moving is that until 4 days ago you weren't moving. But you've been to a bar with me. You've had a private meeting with the old man. You've got a phone I gave you. If Maxwell is even half as good as a 6-year head of corporate security should be, there is a non-zero chance he's already noticed the pattern. And if he's noticed, then she's noticed. And if she's noticed—" He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. If Jocelyn had noticed I was moving, then Jocelyn was recalculating. and a murderer who is recalculating is the most dangerous thing on earth. I sat in my dark car outside a house that watched me, and I felt, for the first time, hunted. The way Elara had described feeling in her letter. Being stalked in your own family, in your own home. What do I do? I said. Nothing different, Shaw said. Slower, if anything, and we find out what Maxwell knows before we assume the worst. I'm going to do something I don't like doing, which is get close to their surveillance and see if it's pointed at you. Give me 2 days. And Caleb, do not sleep too deeply. I did not sleep too deeply. For the next 2 nights, I lay beside Jocelyn in the dark, and I listened to the house, and I learned its sounds, and I kept one hand near the edge of the bed, and I told myself I was being paranoid, and I hoped I was. On the 3rd day, with probate now just 6 days out, Shaw called, and his voice was flat and grim. It's bad, he said. I got eyes on the household security feeds. 2 things. 1, there's a camera on your bedroom hallway that isn't in the official system. A private feed that routes to a device I traced to Arthur Maxwell's personal office, not the monitoring room. Someone has been privately watching the outside of your bedroom door. 2, and this is the one. I pulled Maxwell's calendar and his call metadata, and 6 days ago, the morning after your 3 a.m. message, Maxwell had a 40-minute call with Gavin Thorne, and then Gavin had a call with Jocelyn, and then Maxwell pulled and reviewed 30 days of your car's GPS history. My mouth went dry. So they know. They know you're doing something, Shaw corrected. They don't know what. If they knew what, you'd already have had your accident. The fact that you're still breathing means they're still gathering, same as us. Which means we're in a race now, both sides moving in the dark, and the finish line is probate in 6 days. Because here's the part that matters, Caleb. Here's the part you need to sit down for. I was already sitting. Say it. I got into Gavin's cloud backup, Shaw said. He's sloppy where Jocelyn is careful. Rich men always are. There's a document. A draft. It's an itinerary and a set of talking points for a press statement, and it's dated 8 days from now. 2 days after probate closes. It's a statement of grief, Caleb. It's a prepared statement mourning the tragic loss of Caleb Hayes in a boating accident off the coast, expressing the family's devastation, noting the cruel symmetry of the widower dying near the same waters that took his first wife, and announcing that in this time of grief, the family's affairs will be steadied by the surviving Vance daughter. It's your obituary. They wrote your obituary. It's already written. The plan was never to keep you on a leash forever. The plan was always to let the shares and the trust complete their transfer to you, marry you first so it flows to her clean, and then 2 days later, grieve you into the sea and inherit everything with a spotless face. She's a widow twice over, tragic, brave, holding the family together, and you're a footnote next to Elara. Shaw read me the whole obituary draft over the clean phone, every line of it, because I made him, because I needed to hear all of it, and it was worse than the summary. It was written in Jocelyn's voice, or the voice she'd wear, warm and devastated and brave. Our family is heartbroken to share that Caleb Hayes, beloved husband, devoted steward of Elara's memory, was lost in a boating accident off the coast he loved, near the very waters that took our Elara 3 years ago. Caleb never fully recovered from losing my sister. He found peace at the water's edge, and it is a small, cruel comfort to imagine that in the end, the sea gave him back to her. In this time of unimaginable grief, having now lost both my sister and the man who honored her, I will do everything in my power to hold what remains of our family together. It went on. There were talking points beneath it, actual bullet points, notes for how to manage the press, how to handle the board, a suggested timeline for the memorial service, a line about establishing a small scholarship in my name to control the narrative of grief. They had planned my funeral. They had drafted the sound bites the grieving widow would give at my funeral. They had thought about the scholarship that would make her look generous while she inherited $9 billion over my drowned body. I sat in my car in the dark, and I listened to my wife's voice, in Shaw's flat reading, mourn me in advance with such tender, practiced grief, and something happened to me that had not happened even when I read Elara's letter. I stopped being afraid. Completely. All the way. Because fear needs a future you're trying to protect, and sitting there listening to my own obituary, I understood that in their plan, I had no future. I was already dead. The words were already written, and a man who is already dead in his enemy's plan has nothing left to be afraid of and everything left to take. Read me the last line again, I told Shaw. The one about the sea giving you back to her, he said. No, I said. The scholarship line. Read me the scholarship line. He read it. A small scholarship in his name, to control the narrative of grief. And I laughed, alone in the dark, a sound with no humor in it at all, and I said, She wants to control the narrative of grief. Shaw, I'm going to give her a narrative she can't control if she has 100 years to try. And she's going to have 100 years to try, because that's roughly how long a life sentence feels. Shaw was quiet for a moment on the line, and then he said, softly, there he is. And I didn't ask what he meant, because I knew. He meant that somewhere in the last 11 days, the golden retriever had finished dying, and the thing Elara had trusted to finish her work had finished being born. And it had happened, fully, in a parked car, listening to my own obituary, and there was no undoing it now. I don't remember the drive home that night. I remember arriving. I remember Jocelyn meeting me at the door, warm and lovely, kissing me, asking about my day, and I remember looking at her beautiful face and thinking, with a clarity so total it was almost peaceful, you have already decided I'm going to die. You decided it before you married me. Every kiss for a year has been a countdown. And I remember that I kissed her back, and I smiled, and I said the pasta smelled amazing, and I sat down to dinner across from my murderer, and I ate, because the golden retriever knows nothing, and the golden retriever has 6 days to bury her. That night, lying beside her, I made 3 decisions, and they were the decisions that ended it. The first was that I would not run, and I would not go to the police with what I had, because what I had was stolen and messy, and a good lawyer and a bought security chief could turn 6 days of chaos into a lifetime of Jocelyn walking free, and I would not gamble Elara's justice on a maybe. The second was that I would let the probate close. It was the most dangerous choice of my life. Every instinct screamed to stop it, to freeze the transfer, to protect myself. But I understood something Elara had understood, sitting in that study writing her letter. The transfer was the bait. The $9 billion completing its journey into my hands was the one thing Jocelyn wanted so badly she would abandon all her caution to reach for it. And a predator reaching for bait is a predator with its guard down and its plan exposed. If I let it close, if I let her believe she'd won, she and Gavin and Maxwell would move to the final act, the boating accident. And in moving, they would commit themselves, on a timeline, in a place of my choosing, with Shaw watching and the old man ready, and if I did it right, the law waiting in the dark. I would not stop the trap. I would spring it. The third decision was the one I made looking at the ceiling with Jocelyn's arm across my chest for what I now knew was one of the last times. I decided that I would give her the thing she wanted most, the completion, the win, the moment she thought the vault's last lock had finally clicked open. And then, at the exact height of her triumph, in front of everyone who mattered, I would let my dead wife speak. The next morning, I called the family's event coordinator, cheerful, purposeful, the devoted husband. The library dedication, I said. Elara's memorial. I've been dragging my feet on it, and I shouldn't. Grandfather wants it done properly, and he's right. Let's do it big. The full board, the family, the press, a proper unveiling. And let's time it right. For the symbolism, let's do it the evening the estate finalizes, so it's a night about closing this chapter and honoring her and the family moving forward, whole. There was a pause, and then the coordinator, delighted, said what a beautiful idea. And I hung up, and I sat in my office 38 floors above the city, and I looked out at the coast where my wife had died, and I thought, you want a night when the family stands united and honors her and moves forward. You'll get it. You'll get the whole family, the whole board, the press, the cameras, and the patriarch, all in one room, on the night you think you've won. And I am going to unveil Elara's monument. And then I'm going to unveil you. There was one more person I needed, and finding her was Grandfather Vance's idea. Elara had an assistant, the old man said, the day after our alliance was sealed, his black eyes sharp in the dim study. Lena Wang. Sharp girl, loyal to the bone, the only person besides me who Elara trusted with the things that mattered. Elara kept her close for 6 years. And do you know what happened to Lena Wang 3 weeks after my granddaughter died? I shook my head. She was let go, the old man said. Restructuring, they called it. Signed off by corporate security. By Arthur Maxwell. They cut loose the one person who knew Elara's daily life better than anyone alive, buried her under a severance agreement with a non-disclosure clause, and made sure she never set foot in this building again. Ask yourself why a murderer's first housekeeping move would be to exile a dead woman's assistant, and you'll understand that Lena Wang knows something, even if she doesn't know she knows it. I found Lena Wang in a small design studio across the city, where she'd rebuilt her life doing work far beneath her talents. And when I walked in and she recognized me, her whole face closed like a door. Because to Lena, I was the man who had married Jocelyn, the man who had betrayed Elara's memory by climbing into bed with her sister. And I understood in that moment exactly how the world had seen me for the last 3 years, and I did not blame her one bit. "I have nothing to say to you," she said, standing up behind her desk, and her voice shook with a loyalty that had nowhere to go. "You want to talk about Elara? You lost the right to say her name when you married that woman." I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply took out the clean phone, and I found the first audio file, and I set it on her desk and pressed play. And Elara's voice filled a little studio. "I know about Meridian, Jocelyn. I know about Gavin." And I watched Lena Wang's furious face crumble, watched 3 years of grief and confusion and a non-disclosure agreement's worth of buried suspicion break open all at once. And when it ended, she sat down hard in her chair and put her face in her hands and wept. And then she looked up at me with red eyes and said the sentence that unlocked the middle of the whole case. "I have Elara's real calendar," she said. "Not the one in the company system, her private one, the one only I kept. Maxwell's people scrubbed her official accounts the week she died, but they never knew about the paper one, because Elara didn't trust the system in her last months, and she had me keep her real appointments by hand. It's in a box in my closet. I couldn't throw it away and I couldn't look at it. Mr. Cross." In the last month of her life, Elara had 3 meetings she made me swear to keep off every record. One was with a forensic accountant, one was with a lawyer who doesn't work for the family, and one, 4 days before she died, was with a man whose name I wrote down and never understood. She wiped her face. The name was Maxwell. Lena Wang became the third pillar of the clean case because the forensic accountant Elara had quietly hired had a copy of the Meridian analysis, given to a client who then died, sitting in his files, retrievable with a warrant, entirely legal, no stolen phone required. And the outside lawyer Elara had met with turned out to have drafted, at Elara's instruction, a sealed memorandum documenting her suspicions, a document that had been sitting in a law firm's vault for 3 years waiting for someone to ask, because Elara had told the lawyer, "If anything happens to me, do nothing until my husband comes asking. Only him." Even then, even hiring a lawyer in secret to protect herself, she had built the lock so that only I could open it. I have stopped being surprised by how many doors my dead wife left that only my hand could open. She knew me. She knew that whatever else the years did to me, they would not change the shape of the key. But recruiting Lena had a cost, and the cost nearly killed the whole thing, because for the first time I had pulled a new person into the circle, and new people leave traces, and traces are what Maxwell hunted. 3 days after I met Lena, Jocelyn threw a dinner. She did this sometimes, gathered the board and their spouses at our house for an evening of wine and quiet power, and I had performed at a dozen of them, the pleasant, harmless husband, and I performed at this one too. Except this one was different, because halfway through the dinner, Jocelyn stood to make a toast, and she looked down the long table at me with her lovely smile, and she said, "To my husband, who works so hard, who's always running off to meetings I never hear about." And she laughed, warm, and everyone laughed, and I laughed too, and inside my chest my heart turned to ice, because that was not a joke, that was a probe. That was Jocelyn telling me in front of witnesses that she had noticed my meetings, and watching my face to see what it did. I gave her nothing. I raised my glass and I said, "To my wife, who somehow keeps this whole family standing," and the board murmured approval, and Jocelyn held my eyes for 1 beat too long, and then smiled and sat, and I understood that the clock was faster than I'd thought, that suspicion was hardening, and that I could not afford one more mistake. And then, that very night, I made one. After the guests left, I was helping clear the study where the men had taken their drinks, and I had the clean phone in my jacket, the phone Jocelyn didn't know existed, and it buzzed. Shaw, with an update, a bad habit of his, texting at the worst moment, and I felt it buzz against my chest, and I froze, because Jocelyn was 3 feet away gathering glasses, and she looked up. "Was that your phone?" I had my phone, my normal phone, in my other pocket. If I took that one out, the buzz would be explained. But the buzz had come from the wrong side, and Jocelyn, a woman who had planned murders down to the minute, did not miss which side of a man's chest a sound came from. For one endless second, we looked at each other across the study, and I saw the calculation move behind her eyes, and I did the only thing I could do, which was attack the suspicion head-on before it could set. "It's Shaw," I said, exasperated, and I pulled out my normal phone and showed her the screen, which happened to have a real text from Shaw on it, because Shaw, being Shaw, always texted both phones with an innocent decoy on the clean side days, precisely so this exact moment would have cover. And there it was, a message on my normal phone. "Still can't believe about my marriage. Thanks for last week, man." The divorce lie, the sad friend cover, sitting right there where she could read it. He's a mess, I said, tired. And I let her see the whole thread, the careful weeks of decoy sadness Shaw and I had seeded exactly for this. And I watched Jocelyn read it. And I watched the suspicion look for a place to land, and find only a lonely divorced friend leaning on my shoulder, and slowly, it stood down. But the second phone was still in my jacket, silent now, and if she had asked me to empty my pockets, if she had reached out and patted my chest the way a wife can, it would have been over, all of it. Elara's whole 3-year machine undone by one buzz at the wrong moment. She didn't. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she crossed the room and she put her arms around me and laid her head on my chest, on the wrong side, right over the hidden phone, and she said, softly, "You'd tell me, wouldn't you, if something was going on? If something was wrong? You'd tell me." And I stood there with my wife's murderer's head resting on the evidence that would destroy her, her ear inches from the thing that would send her to prison for life, and I put my arms around her and I said, "There's nothing I'd keep from you, Jocelyn." And it was the biggest lie of my life and the truest sentence I ever spoke to her, because I intended to keep from her exactly one thing, everything, right up until the moment I gave it to the world. She believed me, or she chose to. I've thought about that night more than almost any other, because I think it was the closest I came to losing, and I think some part of Jocelyn knew, some animal part, and chose not to look, because looking would have meant admitting that her golden retriever had teeth, and she had built her entire self-image on the certainty that she was the smartest person in every room. Her arrogance swept me. The same arrogance that had let her walk past Elara's photo every day for a year without a flicker of fear let her rest her head on my chest and choose to hear a heartbeat instead of a bemo. There was a problem with my plan, and it was the biggest one of all, and Shaw named it the night I told him. "Everything you have is poison in a courtroom," he said. "The USB was hidden by a dead woman, fine. That's arguably yours to open. But the burner phone is stolen property. You don't even know how Elara got it, and the confession texts on it are the crown jewel and also the single most challengeable piece of evidence imaginable. Gavin's cloud, the obituary draft, I got that by breaking into his account, which is a felony I committed, and no prosecutor can touch it. If you stand up at that gala and play stolen audio, you'll destroy her reputation for one night, and then Maxwell and a $200 million defense will spend 2 years making all of it vanish on procedure, and she walks, and worse, she knows you moved, and the boating accident just gets rescheduled. Humiliation isn't justice, Caleb. If you want her in a cell and not just crying at a party, we need a clean, parallel case. We need the police to find the same truth on their own, legally, so that when your dead wife speaks at that gala, the handcuffs are real and not theater." He was right, and I hated that he was right, because it meant I needed the one thing I'd been avoiding. A cop. And not just any cop. A cop who couldn't be bought by Maxwell, couldn't be leaned on by the Vance name, and had a reason to already believe. There was exactly one. Detective Delgado. The tired man who had delivered the news of Elara's death 3 years ago and had watched my face the whole time like he was waiting for me to say something I didn't know I was supposed to say. I'd thought about him 100 times since. The way he lingered. The way at the funeral he'd stood at the back and studied the family instead of the coffin. I found him still on the force, a homicide detective now, older and more tired, and I did not go to him with a wild story. Shaw and I did it carefully. We arranged for me to run into him, publicly, ordinarily, a chance meeting at a coffee shop near the precinct, and I sat down across from him uninvited, and before he could brush me off, I said one sentence, quietly. 3 years ago, you thought there was something wrong with my wife's accident, and you couldn't prove it, and it's haunted you ever since. I know because it's haunted me too, and now I can prove it, and I need a cop who can't be bought, because the people who did it own half this city. Delgado went very still. He set down his coffee, and he said, in the voice of a man who has been waiting 3 years for a door to open, "I closed that case because I was told to close it. Corporate security handed us a mechanical report and a witness statement and a lot of pressure from upstairs, and it was clean on paper and filthy in my gut. And I have thought about Elara Vance's face every week for 3 years. Talk. But talk careful, because if you're about to tell me a Vance murdered a Vance, then the man who buried that case is somebody with reach, and reach means we do everything by the book, or we die in the paperwork." So we did it by the book. This is the part that competitor stories always skip, the boring, careful part. But it's the part that put her in prison instead of just in the tabloids, so I'll tell it plainly. I did not give Delgado the stolen phone. Instead, Elara's USB gave us the map, and Delgado followed the map with his own legal feet. The Meridian payments were real corporate records, and once Delgado knew where to look, A properly warranted subpoena to Vance Real Estate's own accounting turned up the exact 60 million, no theft required. The offshore trail Elara had traced by hand, Delgado retraced with financial crimes investigators and international requests, slow but clean, and it led to the same beneficial owner document naming Gavin Thorne. The service garage owned by Maxwell's brother kept records too, and a warrant pulled the real work order for Elara's car, and it showed a brake service performed by a man not on the payroll, on a date the front desk had no appointment for, exactly as Elara's audio had said. Every single thing my dead wife had found in the dark, alone, terrified, Delgado was able to find again in the light, legally, because she had left him a map even though she never knew his name. That was Elara. She built the case so well that it could be rebuilt clean by a stranger. And the burner phone, the beautiful, damning burner phone with its 20 lines of confession, we held in reserve, not for the courtroom, but for the gala, because some evidence is for the judge, and some evidence is for the moment you break a person in half in front of everyone they've ever lied to. The wiretap was the piece that terrified everyone, because a wiretap on a live conspiracy is the single most powerful thing a prosecutor can have, and the single hardest thing to get, especially against wealthy, connected people, especially fast. Delgado needed a judge, and not just any judge, a judge outside the reach of the Vance name and Maxwell's network, and he needed to walk into that judge's chambers with enough clean, legally obtained probable cause that a defense could never later argue the tap was poisoned. This is the part that could have collapsed the entire thing, and it came down to a single afternoon 3 days before the gala, in a judge's chambers, with Delgado laying out the case while I sat outside on a bench in a courthouse hallway, unable to be in the room, unable to do anything but wait and count the tiles on the floor. Delgado had the garage records, real, warranted, showing a brake service by a phantom mechanic. He had the financial crimes preliminary, real, warranted, showing 60 million flowing through Meridian to Gavin Thorne. He had the forensic accountant Elara had hired, alive, findable, with his 3-year-old analysis in a file. He had Lena Wang's private calendar showing Elara meeting Maxwell 4 days before she died. And he had the pattern, the timing, the fact that a probate worth 9 billion was closing in 72 hours, and the sole heir was a man whose wife's sister had a documented 4-year secret relationship with the man who'd stolen the 60 million. What he did not have, what he could not have, was anything from the stolen burner phone, because the moment he touched that, the whole tree became poison fruit. So he built the request without it, on the clean evidence alone, and he argued that there was probable cause to believe a conspiracy to commit murder was not just historical, but ongoing, active, imminent, and that the only way to prevent a second killing was to listen to it being planned. I sat on that bench for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know because I watched every one of them go by on the clock at the end of the hall. And I thought, the whole time, about how close we were to the edge, how this entire structure Elara had built, and I had carried, and Delgado had rebuilt clean came down, in the end, to whether one judge in one afternoon believed a tired detective's stack of paper. If the judge said no, we had the historical case, the humiliation at the gala, but not the live conspiracy, not the ironclad, in-progress murder plot that no lawyer could fog, and Jocelyn might wriggle through on the old evidence the way she'd almost wriggled through the first time. When Delgado finally came out of those chambers, his face gave me nothing, and my heart stopped. And then he sat down next to me on the bench and let out a long breath and said, quietly, "We have the tap. 30 days. She read the whole thing twice, and then she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Detective, if you're wrong about this, it ends your career. And if you're right and you're too slow, a man dies. So don't be either." And she signed it. I put my face in my hands. Not from relief, or not only. From the understanding that Elara had reached even into that judge's chambers, 3 years dead, because every clean piece of paper Delgado put on that desk had come, ultimately, from a map my wife had drawn while she was being hunted, and the tap that would catch her killers in the act existed because she had built her case strong enough, 3 years earlier, to convince a stranger in a black robe on a single afternoon. She kept saving us. Over and over from inside her grave, she kept saving us. Delgado worked fast and quiet. He had 6 days. He pulled in one financial crimes detective he trusted and no one else, because the moment this investigation showed up on any official system Maxwell could touch, it was dead. They worked off the books, off the network, building an arrest package in a race against a probate clock, and I fed them everything Elara had left and everything Shaw could legally hand over. And slowly, over those 6 days, a real case took shape in the dark, running exactly parallel to the fake normal life I was performing above it. Because I was still performing. That was the exhausting part, the part that nearly broke me. Every night I came home to Jocelyn and I was the golden retriever. And Jocelyn, sensing the finish line, sensing her $9 billion completing its long journey, got warmer, not colder, in those final days. That was the cruelest thing. She was tender with me. She cooked my favorite things. She laughed at my jokes and pulled me close at night and told me she'd never been happier. And I understood that this was the tenderness of a woman saying goodbye to a pet she was about to put down. And I had to receive it, and smile, and mean it with my face while my whole soul stood off to the side screaming. I did one reckless thing in those 6 days, and Shaw never forgave me for it, and I'd do it again. I went to the garage. Maxwell's brother's garage, the place where Elara's brakes had been cut, where the fake mechanic had done his work. And I went because there was a piece of the case I needed to see with my own eyes, and because some part of me needed to stand in the physical place where the machinery of my wife's murder had actually turned. I went as a customer. I drove a rental Shaw arranged, under a name that wasn't mine, wearing the kind of clothes a man wears when he doesn't want to be a Vance, and I brought the car in for a squealing brakes complaint I'd manufactured myself, and I sat in the grubby waiting room with its old coffee machine and its year-old magazines while men in coveralls put my rental on a lift, and I watched, and I listened. It was an ordinary garage. That was the thing that got under my skin. The place where they had turned an heiress into a wet road statistic smelled of oil and rubber and burnt coffee, and the radio played classic rock, and a guy named Tom complained about his fantasy football team, and it was so ordinary, so stupidly human, and my wife had died because of a brake line cut in this ordinary room by ordinary hands for money. I got the manager talking. I'm good at getting people talking, it turns out, when I have a reason. I complained about how you can never trust a shop these days, how my buddy took his car somewhere and they swore it was fine and it wasn't, and I watched the manager's face, and I mentioned, casual, that my buddy's car had been serviced here actually, a while back, a Vance family car, and the manager's face did a thing, a small, closing down thing, the exact thing Lena's face had done. The thing guilty people's faces do when you touch the buried thing, and he said too quickly, "We do a lot of fleet work, I wouldn't remember," and turned away, and I knew. I knew I was standing in the right room. And that was when it almost went wrong, because as I was paying, a car pulled into the lot outside, a gray sedan, and 2 men got out, and one of them was the man who had tailed me from the hardware store, and the other was wearing a jacket with a small embroidered logo I recognized from 100 Vance events, corporate security, Maxwell's people, and they were walking toward the office, and I was standing at the counter with my fake name and my real face in the one place on earth I had the least business being. I did not run. Running is what guilty men do, and it is the fastest way to be remembered. I finished paying. I took my receipt. I said something dull to the manager about coming back for an oil change, and I walked out the front, directly past the 2 security men, close enough to touch, my heart a fist against my ribs. And I nodded at them the way one stranger nods at another, and one of them nodded back, distracted, and the other, the one who'd tailed me, glanced at my face for half a second, and I saw the flicker of almost. The flicker of a man whose memory is reaching for something it can't quite grab. And I kept walking, unhurried, to a rental car he'd never seen, with plates he'd never run. And I got in and I drove away at exactly the speed limit while my hands shook on the wheel. And it was not until I was 3 miles gone that I let myself breathe. Shaw was furious when I told him. Properly furious. The only time in the whole thing he raised his voice at me. "You walked into their operation," he said, "past their people, 4 days before we spring the trap. For what? For a feeling? You could have burned everything. You could have gotten yourself killed early." Elara spent the last weeks of her life building a machine so that you wouldn't have to take stupid risks. And you take a stupid risk anyway, at the garage where they murdered her, because you needed to feel something. Don't do that again. And I took it, because he was right, and because underneath the fury was fear. The fear of a man who had already lost too much and had exactly one friend left in the fight and had almost lost him too. "You're right," I said. "I needed to see it. I've seen it. I won't go off the map again." And I didn't. But I'll tell you what the reckless trip gave me, the thing that made it worth Shaw's fury. It gave me certainty. Up until that garage, I had been running on Elara's evidence and Elara's map and Elara's trust, on the word of a dead woman and a stolen phone, and some small, cowardly part of me had still been able to wonder, in the worst hours of the night, whether it was possible I had it wrong, whether there was some innocent explanation, whether the woman sleeping beside me could really have done this. Standing in that ordinary garage, watching that manager's face close down at the word Vance, feeling the guilt come off the place like heat. That last cowardly doubt died, and it never came back. I knew. Not believed. Knew. And a man who knows can do things a man who merely believes cannot. Can smile at a murderer over breakfast for 6 more days. Can let her rest her head on his chest. Can walk her toward the trap without a single tremor. Because certainty is a kind of armor, and I had put it on for good in a waiting room that smelled of burnt coffee. One night, 4 days before the gala, she did something that almost ended me. We were on the couch, and she was tucked against me, and out of nowhere she said, softly, "Do you ever feel guilty? About us? About being happy? When Elara?" And she let it trail off, and I felt the trap in it, the test. And I also felt, underneath the test, something I hadn't expected. A genuine flicker. Because I think even Jocelyn, even the thing that had done what she'd done, had moments where the mask stuck to the skin. And I said, carefully, every day. And then I remember she'd have wanted me to live. She was like that. She always thought about everyone else first. And Jocelyn was quiet for a moment, and then she said, so quietly I almost missed it, yes, she did. That was the problem with her. And a chill went through me because there it was, the truth, slipping out in the dark. That was the problem with her. Elara's goodness had been a problem to be solved. Her sister had murdered her for the crime of caring about the family more than about winning. I held Jocelyn on that couch, and I stared at the far wall, and I let the cold set all the way through me. And I stopped, that night, feeling even the smallest flicker of the thing I'd been afraid I still felt. There was nothing left to save. There never had been. Let me show you the other side of those days, because I've read the phones and heard the testimony, and I know now exactly what was happening in the rooms I wasn't in, and you deserve to see the machine that was smiling at me across the dinner table. Jocelyn did not sleep well in those final days either. I know that now. The woman who lay beside me so warm and so certain was, underneath, a person running a very complicated calculation under a very tight deadline, and even a mind as cold and as capable as hers felt the strain of it. She met Gavin twice that week, always somewhere ordinary, a gallery, a charity lunch, places where a Vance daughter and a prominent investor could be photographed together and mean nothing. And in the corners of those bright public rooms, they murdered me in low voices. He's different, Jocelyn told Gavin at the gallery, and Gavin, sipping champagne, said, different how? And Jocelyn watched me across the room, where I was performing charm at a board member's wife, and she said, I can't put my finger on it. He's more present. He used to drift. Since the memorial planning started, he's sharper. It's probably grief. Finishing her monument, closing the chapter. But I don't like things I can't put my finger on. And Gavin, greedy Gavin, impatient Gavin, said the thing that sealed the timeline. Then stop putting your finger on it and finish it. The estate closes in 6 days. Mary Clean is done, the transfer's done, there's nothing left to wait for except the 6 months, and I'm tired of waiting for the 6 months, Jocelyn. Do it at the memorial, it's perfect. He slips away to Griver at the water where she died, the poetic widower, and he doesn't come back, and you're the tragic sister who held the family together through 2 losses, and nobody looks twice. I've thought a great deal about the fact that it was Gavin's impatience, not Jocelyn's caution, that moved my death up to the gala. If Jocelyn had had her way, I'd have lived another 6 months on the leash, and Delgado would have had 6 more months to build, and everything would have been slower and safer. It was greed that accelerated it, and greed that exposed it, because a plan rushed is a plan with edges, and edges are what you catch people on. Maxwell argued against it. That's the part that still makes my skin crawl, because Maxwell was the professional, and Maxwell had instincts, and Maxwell's instincts were screaming. 2 deaths near the same water, in the same family, 3 years apart, Maxwell told them, in a meeting Shaw later pulled the audio of, is not poetic, it's a pattern, and patterns get investigated. Elara's accident held because it was isolated. You do the husband the same way, in the same place, and you're daring some tired detective to draw a line between 2 dots. And there's a detective I've checked, Delgado, who never liked how the first one closed. I'm telling you, wait the 6 months, do it far away, do it different, do it boring. Boring is what keeps you free. And Jocelyn, God, Jocelyn, listen to her professional tell her the exact truth that would have saved her. The truth that there was a detective named Delgado who never liked how it closed, and she overrode him. Because Gavin wanted it fast, and Jocelyn wanted the whole thing done, and some arrogant part of her had started to believe she genuinely could not lose. One more accident, she told Maxwell. Clean, like the first. You made the first one perfect. Make this one perfect. And then we're done. All of us. Forever. Rich and free and finished. Maxwell took the job. He took it against his own judgment because they paid him enough to silence the instinct that would have saved all three of them. And that is the thing I've come to understand about people like Maxwell, the careful, competent professionals who enable the monsters. Their skill is real, and their instincts are real, and none of it matters, because in the end, they sell the one thing that would have protected them, which is the willingness to say no. He booked the boat. He assigned the crew, two men who thought they were being paid to help stage an accident and had no idea they were narrating a murder conspiracy into a warrant Delgado didn't have yet, but was about to. He mapped the camera blind spots on the dock. He did his careful professional work in service of a rushed amateur decision, and every text he sent, every call he made, every arrangement he confirmed, went into the record that would bury him, because the careful man had agreed to do a careless thing for money, and there is no amount of professionalism that survives that trade. And Jocelyn came home to me each of those nights, and she was warm, and she was tender, and she told me she loved me, and now I know that on at least 2 of those nights, she had spent the afternoon arranging my drowning, and had come home and kissed me and asked about my day, and there is a lesson in that I have never been able to fully put down. The tenderness was real, in its way. That's the horror of it. Jocelyn was not pretending to feel warmth when she held me. She simply lived in a place where warmth and murder did not contradict each other, where you could genuinely enjoy a man's company and plan his death in the same afternoon and feel no crack between the two. And I had spent a year inside that place without knowing it had no floor. So when I tell you there was nothing left to save, I mean it in the most complete way. It was not that Jocelyn felt nothing. It was that what she felt had no connection to what she did. And a person like that cannot be reached, cannot be saved, cannot be loved into something else, can only be stopped. And I was going to stop her. Meanwhile, across the city, the other side was moving too. I learned most of this later, from the phones and the testimony, but I'll tell it the way it happened, because you should see the machine that was grinding toward me in those final days. Gavin Thorne was nervous. He was the sloppy one, the greedy one, and with the probate finally closing, he wanted his money back, wanted to reopen the Meridian pipeline, wanted to celebrate. Jocelyn kept him leashed, the same way she leashed everyone. 6 months after the husband, she told him, in a call Shaw would later pull. Not a day before. We did this once perfectly. We do it again perfectly. Maxwell handles the boat. It reads as an accident. We grieve beautifully. And then, Gavin, then we have all of it, and all the time in the world. And Maxwell, the security chief, the careful one, was the only one of the 3 who was truly worried. Because Maxwell was a professional, and professionals trust their instincts, and his instincts were itching. He'd seen the pattern in my movements. The bar, the old man, the car's GPS. He couldn't prove I was doing anything, but he didn't like it. And 3 days before the gala, he did the thing that nearly unraveled everything. He had me followed. I didn't know. I was leaving a hardware store of all places, a prop errand for the library dedication, when Shaw called me on the clean phone, his voice sharp and low. Do not react. Do not look around. There's a gray sedan that's been on you for 2 hours, 2 men, and I clocked the plate. It traces to a shell that traces to Maxwell's brother's garage. You're being tailed. Get in your car, drive normal, drive to the office, go up, be boring, and leave the clean phone in the car. They can't hear it, but they can see it. Whatever you do not lead them to Delgado, and do not lead them to me. My heart was slamming, but my hands were calm, because I've been living in this for 11 days now, and the fear had become a tool. I got in my car. I drove to the office. I was boring. And that night I came home to Jocelyn, and I could not know, looking at her lovely, welcoming face, whether Maxwell had reported something that had tipped her over from suspicion into certainty. Whether the tenderness she showed me at dinner was a goodbye to a pet, or the final performance of a woman who now knew her husband was hunting her and had decided to move the boating accident up. I lay awake all night with my hand near the edge of the bed. She slept, or seemed to, and in the morning, with 3 days left, the phone Shaw had given me buzzed once, in the car, with a message that made the whole world go quiet and sharp. It was from Shaw. It said, Maxwell moved the boat. It's booked for the night of the gala. Not 2 days after. The night of. Caleb, they're not waiting for probate to close clean anymore. Something spooked them. The plan now is the gala, the family together, you slip away for a private moment on the water to honor Elara where she died, poetic, and you don't come back. They're going to try to kill you at the same event where you're planning to expose them. Whoever springs their trap first, wins. We have 3 days. 3 days. I should have been terrified. Instead, reading that message in my car, I felt something click into a kind of terrible peace, because they had just done the thing I needed them to do. They had committed. They had a boat, a date, a place, a method. Up until that moment, everything Delgado had was financial, historical, a paper case about a 3-year-old death, strong but cold, the kind of case a great lawyer can fog. But a plan to commit a murder in 3 days is not history. It's a conspiracy in progress, live, catchable, and if we could document it as it moved, then Delgado wouldn't be arresting Jocelyn for something that might have happened 3 years ago. He'd be arresting her for something she was about to do, tonight, on this boat, to this man, with these accomplices. And that is a case that does not fog. I called Shaw and I said, "We don't stop the boat. We let them book it. We let them plan it. We watch every inch of it, and we make sure Delgado has eyes and ears on it, and we turn their murder into the evidence." There was a silence, and then Shaw said, "You're proposing to use yourself as live bait for your own killing, in order to catch them in the act. You understand that if any single thing goes wrong, the boat isn't a trap for them, it's a coffin for you." "Then don't let anything go wrong," I said. We spent 3 days building it. Delgado, when I told him, went pale and then furious, and then, being the kind of cop he was, methodical. He would not sanction me actually getting on that boat. That was a line he wouldn't cross, and I didn't argue because I never intended to be on it when it mattered. The plan we built was this. The gala would proceed exactly as I designed it: the library dedication, the family, the board, the press, the patriarch. Delgado and his financial crimes partner would be present, credentialed as event security through a channel Maxwell didn't control, because Grandfather Vance, it turned out, still personally held the authority to add names to the guest list of a family event, and the old man added too. At a moment of my choosing, I would take the stage to unveil Elara's monument, and I would give the eulogy the family expected, and then I would give them a different one. I would let Elara speak. And the instant her recorded voice named her killers in front of the board and the cameras, Delgado would move. But not on the humiliation alone, because we still needed the clean case to land the arrest, and here is where the boat became beautiful. Shaw had gotten into the boat's own systems, its GPS, its comms, the phones of the 2 men Maxwell had hired to crew it, and every communication those men made about the job, every text from Maxwell coordinating the accident, every confirmation from Gavin, every instruction was being captured, legally now, because Delgado had walked a judge through the parallel case and gotten a real warrant for the conspirators' communications on the strength of the financial case and the garage records and the pattern. So while Jocelyn and Gavin and Maxwell spent 3 days quietly arranging to drown me at my dead wife's memorial, they were narrating their own murder conspiracy directly into a lawful wiretap. They thought they were the hunters. They were talking into the microphone. The night before the gala, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I went to Elara's grave. Alone, late, on the pretext of needing air, which by then Jocelyn granted me easily because the golden retriever was so thoroughly harmless. I stood over the stone with her name on it, Elara Vance Hayes, beloved, and the dates that were a robbery, and I didn't cry, because I'd done all my crying 11 days ago on the floor of the study. I just talked to her. I told her I'd found it. I told her I understood now what she'd done and why, and how smart she'd been, and how sorry I was that I'd been so easy to fool, that I'd married her killer, that I'd let it take a message from beyond the grave to wake me up. And I told her that tomorrow it ended. I told her the map she'd left had been followed all the way to the door, and tomorrow I was going to open that door in front of the whole world and let everyone see what had been living in the dark. And I made her the last promise. "After tomorrow," I said, to the stone, to the cold air, to the woman who had loved a boy in a closet and married him against the whole world, "I'll do the other thing you asked. I'll let you go. I'll actually live. But not tonight. Tonight, my love, you and I have one more job." I drove home. Jocelyn was waiting up, of course. She was always waiting up now, in these last days, like she couldn't quite let me out of her sight, and I've wondered since whether that was suspicion, or the boat's shadow, or some last confused animal part of her that didn't want to do it. And I've decided I don't care. She was in the lamplight in our bed, and she looked up at me with those lovely eyes, and she said, "You went to see her?" Not a question. I stood in the doorway, and I understood this was the last real test, the night before, and I gave her the truest lie of my life. "I went to say goodbye," I said. "The dedication's tomorrow, 3 years. I've been holding on to her for 3 years, Jocelyn, and tomorrow I put up her monument, and I think I finally let the rest of it go." And I watched the words land, watched them do exactly what she needed them to do, watched the last flicker of her suspicion drown in the relief of hearing her golden retriever announce that he was, at last, fully, finally hers, unguarded, unattached, ready to be led onto a boat. She held out her hand to me across the bed. Her eyes were bright. "Come here," she said softly. "Tomorrow's going to change everything. I can feel it." "So can I said, and I crossed the room, and I took the hand of the woman who had murdered my wife and intended to murder me, and I got into bed beside her one last time, and I let her hold me, and over her shoulder, in the dark, my eyes were open and dry and steady, and I counted the hours until the gala. Meanwhile, in a penthouse across the city, Gavin Thorne poured himself a drink he'd been saving for 3 years and toasted the empty room. "To Elara," he said, and laughed because he thought he was clever, and he texted Jocelyn a single word, "tomorrow," and that word went into the wiretap along with everything else. One more nail he was hammering into his own coffin, thinking it was hers. And in a small office in the Vance Tower, Arthur Maxwell, the careful one, the professional, sat late reviewing the boat plan one more time, and the crew assignments, and the camera blind spots, and something in his professional gut itched one more time. Some sense that the mark had been too calm, too easy, these last few days, and he almost ordered another sweep of my car and my devices. And then he looked at the countdown. 1 day, and he thought about how much money was 1 day away, and he decided the itch was nerves, and he went home. That decision, the careful man's one careless moment, is the reason all 3 of them are where they are now. The morning of the gala, I woke before the alarm and lay in the gray light and listened to Jocelyn breathe. And I thought about the first morning, 11 days ago, when I'd lain exactly like this with her arm across my chest and a dead woman's message burning in my phone. And I'd promised myself I'd become the best actor in the world. I'd kept the promise. One more performance, the biggest one. I slipped out of bed. I showered. I put on the suit I'd chosen, dark, sharp, the suit a man wears to honor his dead wife. And I stood in front of the mirror the way you do before a war. And behind me in the reflection, Jocelyn stirred and woke and smiled at me, sleepy and radiant, and said, "You look handsome. She'd be proud of you today." And I looked at my wife's murderer in the mirror, and I smiled back and I said, "Let's give her a night to remember." I meant it more than she could possibly know. The gala was held at the coastal site itself, on the broad stone terrace beside the finished floating library. Elara's dream. My dream. The building that had started everything and, the day it was finally real enough to dedicate, had also become the place my wife drove to die. The sun was setting over the water when I arrived, painting the whole coast gold, and the library floated on its reflecting pool like something out of the drawing I'd made in a closet 10 years before, and for a moment, just a moment, standing there in the gold light, I let myself feel the grief clean, without the rage, and I let Elara see it finished. Then I put the grief away, because I had work to do. 300 people. The full Vance board in their dark suits, investors, press, cameras, a podium set before the glowing library, a velvet cloth over the bronze memorial plaque waiting to be unveiled. Grandfather Vance in his wheelchair near the front, ancient and upright and burning, his black eyes finding mine across the crowd and holding one heartbeat, a promise. Delgado and his partner near the back, in event security credentials, quiet, patient, phones in their pockets connected to a van parked out of sight where a judge's warrant and a live wiretap were recording everything the boat crew said. And Jocelyn. Jocelyn on my arm in a gown the color of deep water, luminous, gracious, the perfect bereaved then healed Vance daughter, greeting the board, accepting condolences that were 3 years old, and beside her, arriving separately, all charm and photographs, Gavin Thorne, the beloved investor, here to support the family in their night of remembrance. And moving quietly at the edges, dark suit, earpiece, eyes everywhere, Arthur Maxwell, running security for the event exactly as he'd run it for 6 years, not knowing that tonight the cameras belonged to us. The boat waited at the private dock below the terrace, lit and gentle on the darkening water. My accident, scheduled for later, when the widower slipped away to grieve at the water's edge where his first wife died. They had it all arranged. So did I. I want to slow down here, at the gala, because this was the hinge of everything. The 2 hours in which I either walked out a free man who had avenged his wife, or floated face down in the water where she died. And the margin between those 2 outcomes was thinner than anyone watching could have known. Everything had to happen in the right order. If I revealed too early, before Delgado's people were in position at the exits, Maxwell could get Jocelyn and Gavin out a side door and into the machinery of money and lawyers before the handcuffs ever came. If I revealed too late, if I let the evening drift toward the moment I was meant to slip away to the boat, I'd be exposing them while standing next to my own scheduled grave with a security chief who knew the water. There was a window. Shaw had calculated it almost to the minute. After the speeches, before the boat, during the unveiling. That was when 300 witnesses would be gathered and focused, when the press cameras would already be rolling for the memorial, when Delgado's 2 credentialed officers would have drifted, casually, to cover the 2 exits that mattered, and when the wiretap van outside would be live and recording. A window maybe 20 minutes wide, and I had to walk my wife's murderers into it without any of the 3 of them, all of them sharper than most people alive, sensing the shape of the room closing around them. So I worked the party. I was radiant. I have never been so charming in my life as I was in the 90 minutes before I destroyed her. Shaking hands, accepting condolences, laughing at board members' jokes, playing the healed and grateful widower on the night of his dead wife's monument. And every smile was a lie, and every lie bought a minute, and every minute moved a police officer a little closer to a door. I watched Delgado out of the corner of my eye without ever looking at him, watched him nurse a drink he didn't touch and drift, so slowly, so naturally, toward the terrace's western stair, while his partner found a reason to stand near the eastern one. I watched Gavin Thorne work the room in the other direction, glad-handing investors, flush with the confidence of a man whose plan is 2 hours from completion. I watched Maxwell at the edges, in his dark suit, his eyes moving, and once, only once, Maxwell's eyes found me across the crowd and held, that professional itch flaring one last time, and I raised my glass to him, friendly, empty, the harmless son-in-law, and after a moment he nodded and looked away, and the itch lost, and the window stayed open. And I watched Jocelyn. My wife, luminous in deep water blue, moving through the crowd like she owned the tide. And she was happy, genuinely happy, I could see it. This was her coronation, the night the last lock opened, the family gathered and the fortune complete, and her tedious golden retriever about to conveniently drown. And she caught my eye across the terrace and she smiled at me, private, warm, ours. And I smiled back and lifted my glass an inch, and inside I thought, look at me, keep looking at me, be happy, be as happy as you can possibly be, because I want you at the very top when it comes. I want the fall to be the whole height. The evening moved through its courses. Speeches, a board member on Elara's brilliance, a eulogy from a family friend. Jocelyn herself took the podium and spoke about her sister with a catch in her voice that 300 people found unbearably moving, about loss, about family, about how proud Elara would be to see the library finished. And I stood at the side and watched her lie beautifully to a crowd with wet eyes, and I did not feel rage anymore, only a great and final cold. And when she stepped down and came to me and squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're up, my love, make it beautiful," I squeezed back and I said, "I will." And I walked up to the podium in front of 300 people, and the cameras, and the board, and the patriarch, and my wife's murderers. And I set down my single page of notes that I would not use, and I began. I thanked them for coming. I talked about the library, about the boy in the closet and the woman who said he didn't belong there, about how this building was a drawing before it was a dream, and a dream before it was stone. I felt the crowd settle into the warm grief of it. I saw Jocelyn, front row now, beside Gavin, her face soft and proud. I saw Grandfather Vance watching me with those black eyes. And then I changed the subject, gently, the way you turn a knife. 3 years ago, I said, my wife drove to this exact site, alone, at sunset, to walk these cliffs before the machines came, because she wanted to say goodbye to the empty place before it became the full one. And she never arrived. Her brakes failed on a wet road, they told us. A tragic accident, nobody's fault. I let that sit. The crowd was very quiet now. Jocelyn's proud, soft face had not changed, but I saw her fingers find Gavin's sleeve. I believed that for 3 years, I said. I built my whole second life on believing it. And then, 11 nights ago, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I received a message. The terrace was silent enough now to hear the water. It was from Elara. A ripple went through the crowd, confusion, discomfort. Jocelyn's head tilted, the first crack, the exact tilt I'd seen the night I walked out to meet Shaw. Gavin had gone still. Near the back, Delgado shifted his weight. My wife, I said, was smarter than everyone who ever underestimated her, which was everyone. She knew she was in danger before she died. She couldn't prove it in time, so she did what she did best. She built something. She hid the truth where only I could find it, and she set it to reach me if the worst thing happened. If I was ever fool enough, ever broken enough, to marry the person who did this to her. And 11 nights ago, the worst thing had happened, and her message found me, lying in bed, next to my new wife. I looked directly at Jocelyn, and Jocelyn looked back at me, and I watched the mask, the beautiful, flawless, year-long mask, begin, at last, to slip. Because she was smart. She was so smart, and she understood, 3 seconds before anyone else in that crowd, exactly what was about to happen. "I'd like you all to hear my wife's voice," I said. "She recorded this 3 weeks before she died." And I nodded to the sound engineer at the side of the stage, a man Shaw had briefed personally, and Elara's voice came out of the speakers across the terrace, over the water, steady and heartbroken and alive. "I know about Meridian, Jocelyn. I know about Gavin. I know all of it, and I'm giving you 1 week to come to grandfather with me and make it right before I take it to the board." And then Jocelyn's own recorded voice, warm and wounded, filling the night. "Elara, you have it all wrong. Let me explain. Please, just give me time. Don't do anything. Don't tell anyone." The terrace erupted in whispers. 300 heads turned toward Jocelyn, who had gone white, who was rising from her seat, who said, "This is, Caleb, this is grief. He's not well. This is..." And I spoke over her, calm, amplified, unstoppable. "There's more," I said. "Elara traced $60 million stolen out of the division she ran, through a shell company called Meridian Advisory, into an offshore trust owned by this man." I pointed at Gavin Thorne. "Her sister's secret lover of 4 years. And she found the mechanic who serviced her car, a man who wasn't on the garage's payroll, working under the protection of this family's own head of security, Arthur Maxwell." Heads whipped toward Maxwell, who had his hand to his earpiece, who was already moving toward the exits, and found Delgado's partner standing calmly in his path. "And 3 weeks before her brakes failed," I said, "Elara recorded this." Her voice again, tired, frightened, the voice I couldn't bear. "My brakes are wrong. I'm going to stop driving that car. I'm going to tell Caleb everything this weekend." The crowd made a sound like a single held breath breaking. Jocelyn was fully standing now, and the mask was gone, entirely gone, and what was underneath it was something I had never seen in a year of marriage, something cold and fast and cornered, and she said, loudly, steadying, brilliant even now, "My sister was ill. She was paranoid in her final months. Everyone knew it. She imagined betrayals, and this poor man, my husband, has been manipulated by someone with doctored audio. This is a cruel hoax, and I won't stand here." She was good. God, she was good. Even now, improvising, she was reaching for the story that would save her, the hysterical dead sister, the manipulated widower, the doctored tape. And half the crowd wavered, because that's how it works. That's how people like her always survive. They hand the crowd a comfortable lie, and the crowd grabs it. So I gave her the thing that no story could survive. "Then explain this one," I said. "This isn't Elara. This is you." And I nodded again, and the sound engineer played the last file, the one from the burner phone, the 20 lines, Jocelyn's own text messages, read aloud by a flat computer voice over the speakers, while the words themselves rose onto the huge screen behind me, letter by letter, in front of the board and the cameras and the patriarch and 300 witnesses. "Is it done with the car?" "A says it'll read as a failure. Wet road tomorrow. Perfect timing." "She thinks I'm going to confess. Sweet, stupid Elara. She always did think the family came first." "And the husband?" "The husband is a golden retriever. When she's gone, he'll fall apart, and I'll be the one who catches him. Give it a year. I'll have the whole thing, the shares, the trust, all of it, and a grieving widower on a leash. Trust me, I know how to be loved." The last line hung on the screen in letters 4 feet tall. "I know how to be loved." And the terrace went utterly, absolutely silent. 300 people staring at the words, and then staring at Jocelyn, and I watched it happen. I watched the exact thing I had promised myself I would see. I watched the mask come off in public, in front of everyone she had ever charmed, and I watched her understand that there was no story left, no version, no way out, that her own words were on a screen 40 feet wide, and there was nowhere in the world to put them. Jocelyn Vance looked at the screen. She looked at the board, at the cameras, at her grandfather. And then she looked at me. And for one moment, one single moment, the cornered thing behind her eyes went very still, and she said quietly, just to me, in a voice the microphones didn't catch, "You were supposed to be simple." "So was Elara," I said. "You both underestimated the people you married." That was when Gavin Thorne bolted. He was the sloppy one, the greedy one, the one without the nerve for the endgame, and he shoved back his chair and turned to run. And Delgado was there. Delgado and his partner, unhurried. And Delgado had his badge out, and his voice was the tired, flat voice of a man who had waited 3 years for this exact moment. "Gavin Thorne," he said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, the murder of Elara Vance Hayes, and the attempted murder of Caleb Hayes scheduled for tonight aboard the vessel currently waiting at that dock. A plan we have been recording your co-conspirators discussing for the last 72 hours under a lawful warrant. The last words landed on the crowd like a bomb. Attempted murder scheduled for tonight, aboard that dock, and every head turned to the lit boat gently waiting on the black water. The boat I was supposed to slip away to, the boat I was supposed to die on, and the whole beautiful, terrible plan stood exposed in the open air. Maxwell tried the exits and found police. Gavin went down struggling, shouting that it was all Jocelyn. It was always Jocelyn. He'd only handled the money, in the first 30 seconds, selling out the woman he'd conspired with for 4 years. Exactly as Jocelyn had once predicted men like him always would. And Jocelyn did not run. That's the thing I'll never forget. She stood in her deep water gown in front of 300 people and the ruin of her entire life, and she did not run, and she did not weep, and she did not beg. She simply looked at me, and then she turned and looked at Grandfather Vance, the old king in his wheelchair, and she said, to him, in a clear, cold voice, "You'd have given it all to her. You never once looked at me. Everything I did because in this family the second daughter is furniture, and I decided I would rather be a monster than a chair." And Grandfather Vance rose. He had not stood unaided in 2 years. He rose out of that wheelchair with his cane trembling under his hand and his whole ancient frame shaking with the effort and with something bigger than effort. And he stood to his full height in front of the granddaughter who had murdered the other one, and the terrace held its breath, and the old man said, in a voice that carried to the water, "You were never furniture, Jocelyn. You were my grandchild, and I loved you, and that is what you murdered. Not a chair, not a rival. My love for you. You killed it the day you killed her, and I have grieved you as long as I grieved Elara without even knowing it." He was weeping now, openly, the great old ruin of a man. "You want to know why I never looked at you the way you wanted? It's because when you were small, I already saw this in you, and I prayed I was wrong, and I have never in my long life been sorrier to be right. Take her." And Delgado took her. He read her rights to her in the golden dark, in front of the cameras, the floating library glowing behind her, Elara's dream shining down on the arrest of Elara's killer, and Jocelyn Vance let herself be handcuffed without a word, her chin high, her eyes dry, and as they walked her past me, she stopped, just for a second, and she looked at me one last time, and whatever she saw in my face made the cold, cornered thing behind her eyes finally break, just slightly, just at the very edge, and she said, so softly, "Was any of it real, for you?" And I thought about a year of lies, hers and then mine, and I gave her the truth, because the truth was the cruelest thing I owned. "The last 11 days were," I said, "every smile, every kiss goodnight, every morning I made you coffee, all of it was real, Jocelyn. It was the realest acting I've ever done, because every single second of it I was thinking about her." And I watched that land, and I watched her understand that the golden retriever had stopped existing 11 nights ago, and she'd been sleeping beside a stranger who was burying her the whole time. And then they walked her away, down the terrace, past the board and the cameras and the whispering crowd, and out of the gold light into the dark, and Elara's library glowed on over the water, and it was, at last, finished. I stood on that terrace for a long time after they took her away, in the gold light with the library glowing over the water, while around me 300 people dissolved into chaos, and the press went feral, and board members shouted into phones. I did not move. Shaw appeared at my side, quiet, solid, and he put a hand on my shoulder, and he didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. And we watched together as Delgado's people brought up the 2 men from the boat, the crew Maxwell had hired, who had been sitting at the dock waiting to help a widower have an accident, and had instead spent the last 72 hours narrating a conspiracy into a warrant. They came up the dock stairs in handcuffs, blinking in the party lights, bewildered, small, and one of them, a young one, kept saying he didn't know. He thought it was an insurance thing. He didn't know it was murder. And maybe that was even true. Maybe Maxwell had told them just enough and no more. But it didn't matter, because the recordings had them. And the recordings were clean. And the boat that was meant to be my grave became instead the single most damning piece of physical evidence in the entire case. A vessel booked and crewed and blind-spotted for a murder that the intended victim was standing on dry land watching get dismantled. I walked down to the dock, once, alone, past the police tape, and I stood at the edge and I looked at the boat rocking gently on the black water, lit up and empty now, and I thought about how I was supposed to be on it. How the plan was for me to slip away from my dead wife's memorial to grieve at the water where she died, poetic, and to go into that same water myself, and to become a headline next to her, the tragic widower, the cruel symmetry, and for Jocelyn to weep beautifully and inherit the world. I stood at the edge of the dock where my death had been scheduled, and the water lapped at the pilings, the same sea that had taken Elara, and I did not feel afraid, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt her. I felt Elara, in the cold, salt air, in the glow of the library she dreamed in a closet and died driving toward. And I said to her, under my breath, so quietly that only the water could hear, "It's done. I finished it. You can rest now." And the sea said nothing, because the sea never does, but the library glowed on behind me, and that was answer enough. Delgado found me there a few minutes later. He stood beside me at the edge of the dock, tired, older than the man who delivered the news 3 years before, and he looked at the boat, and then at the water, and then at me, and he said, 3 years. I closed that case in 3 weeks because they made me, and I've thought about her every week since. I want you to know something, because you should hear it from the cop who failed her the first time. She built this. All of it. The map, the evidence, the trail I followed. She left it all so clean that a stranger could rebuild it. And I'm the stranger. And I did. And the reason your wife's killer is in a car right now, instead of at a party, is that Elara Vance was, without exception, the smartest victim I have ever investigated in 30 years of doing this. Most people who are murdered never see it coming. She saw it coming, and she outthought it from beyond the grave. You didn't just marry a good woman, Mr. Cross. You married the best mind I ever came across, and it took her being dead for me to understand that, and I'm sorry it did. I couldn't answer him. I just nodded, and we stood there, 2 men who had failed her in different ways and been redeemed by her in the same way. And we watched the boat rock on the water where she died, and behind us, the library that would carry her name into the next century poured its warm light out over the whole cold coast. The story broke everywhere by morning. You couldn't escape it. Eris murdered by her own sister, exposed by the dead woman's message from beyond the grave at her own memorial, the golden retriever husband who turned out to be the hunter, the boat waiting at the dock. The press could not have written it better if they'd made it up, and for once the truth was worse and stranger than any story. And the Vance name, which Jocelyn had killed to inherit, became overnight a name that meant only one thing: her crime. There is a certain justice in that I've never stopped appreciating. She murdered her sister to own the family's name and legacy, and the only legacy she ended up owning was the headline. The trials took the better part of 2 years, because money and lawyers can slow anything down. But they cannot, when the case is clean, stop it. And Elara had made the case clean, and Delgado had made it cleaner, and the wiretap of 3 people planning my murder in real time was not a thing that any defense on earth could fog. I will not bore you with the machinery of it, but I'll tell you where the 3 of them landed, because you've come this far, and because the competitor stories I used to study always understood that the audience stays for the downfall. Gavin Thorne broke first and fastest, exactly as Jocelyn had once said men like him always do. He testified against her to save his own skin, laid out the 4 years, the 60 million, the plan, all of it, and it did not save him, because the wiretap had him confirming the murder in progress in his own greedy voice, and he was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Elara and conspiracy in the attempt on me. And the offshore money he'd hidden so cleverly was traced and clawed back, and he went to prison a poor man, which for Gavin Thorne was its own particular hell, because Gavin had never in his life understood being anything except rich. I watched him testify. It was one of the strangest hours of the whole trial, because Gavin, on the stand, trying to save himself by burying Jocelyn, could not stop being Gavin, could not stop being charming and aggrieved, and certain the room would side with him if he just explained it well enough. And he sat there, in his expensive suit that meant nothing now, and he told the jury that it had all been Jocelyn's idea, that she had seduced him into it, that he had only handled the money and never wanted anyone hurt, and the whole time he talked, Jocelyn sat at the defense table and watched him with an expression of such pure, cold contempt that I almost felt something like the old sympathy, because Gavin was betraying her exactly as she had once predicted men like him always would. The husband is a golden retriever, she'd written, but she'd never written what Gavin was, and now we all saw it. Gavin was a coward who'd spent 4 years thinking he was a mastermind. When the prosecutor played the wiretap for the jury, the recording of Gavin's own voice pushing to move my murder up to the gala. "Stop putting your finger on it and finish it, I'm tired of waiting." Gavin's charming, aggrieved face finally cracked, because there is no explaining away your own voice scheduling a man's death, and he looked over at Jocelyn as if she could still save him, as if she were still the partner who always had a plan. and Jocelyn looked back at him and mouthed two words that the court reporter couldn't record, but that I read clearly from where I sat, because I had spent a year learning that face. She mouthed, "Golden Retriever." She was calling him what she'd called me. In the end, she had the same word for the man she'd loved for 4 years and the man she'd married to murder. Because to Jocelyn, there had only ever been two kinds of people, the ones running the game and the ones being run. And Gavin had just discovered, 40 years old on a witness stand, which kind he'd been the whole time. He went down for everything. The charm bought him nothing. The money that had been his entire identity was clawed back across 3 jurisdictions and returned to the estate. And Gavin Thorne, who had never once in his life carried a thing he couldn't buy his way out of, walked into a cell as poor as I had been in the closet where Elara found me. And I have thought about that symmetry more than once. The man who murdered for a fortune ending with less than the man who gave one away. Arthur Maxwell, the careful one, the professional, the man whose one careless moment the night before the gala had let the whole thing stand, went down for the accident itself, because the garage records and his brother's cooperation and the fake mechanic he'd hired painted the picture of exactly who had made a murder look like a mechanical failure and then buried the investigation from inside the family's own security office. 6 years of loyalty he'd sold, and it bought him a cell and a legacy as the man who let a monster into the house he was paid to guard. His brother took a deal and testified. There is no honor among people like that, none. And watching them turn on each other in those courtrooms, one after another, each one certain they could still win, was like watching a building I designed come down exactly along the fault lines I'd drawn. Maxwell was the one who broke me a little, and not out of pity. Maxwell, at his own sentencing, was allowed to make a statement, and where Gavin had begged and Jocelyn had stayed silent, Maxwell did the professional thing one last time, and it was the coldest, clearest account of the whole crime anyone gave, because Maxwell had no charm to fall back on and no delusion left to protect. He stood up and he said, in that flat security man's voice, "I want the record to be accurate, because accuracy is the only thing I was ever good at. I knew what I was doing 3 years ago when I made the first one look like an accident, and I knew what I was doing when I shut down the old man's audit, and I knew, this time, that moving on the husband at the memorial was a mistake, and I said so, and I did it anyway, because they paid me enough to override my own judgment. That's the whole of it. I wasn't seduced, and I wasn't tricked. I was a professional who sold the one thing a professional is actually paid for, which is the willingness to say no when the job is wrong. I said yes to everything for 6 years, and this is where saying yes ends." And then he sat down, and he did not look at Jocelyn, and he did not look at me, and I understood that Maxwell was, in his own terrible way, the only honest person on that side of the aisle, a man who had done monstrous things for money and refused, at the very end, to pretend he'd done them for any other reason. It haunts me more than Gavin's cowardice or Jocelyn's silence, because Maxwell's crime is the most common one in the world, the one that isn't monstrous at all in the moment, the one that's just a competent person, a good person even, in most rooms, choosing the money over the no, one small yes at a time, until one day the yeses have built a coffin and there's a granddaughter in it. I put that in the buildings too, in a way. Every plaque, every scholarship, every kid in a window seat over the water is a small argument against the thing Maxwell did. An argument that some things should not be for sale. That the willingness to say no when the job is wrong is not a weakness to be traded away, but the whole of a person's worth. And that a fortune spent building places where that lesson can be learned is a fortune finally being used for the only thing it was ever good for. And Jocelyn never broke. Through the whole trial, she sat straight-backed and cold and brilliant, and her lawyers tried the ill sister story, and the manipulated widower story, and the doctored evidence story. And one by one, Elara's map and Delgado's clean parallel case took each story apart in front of the jury. And at the end of it, Jocelyn Vance was convicted of the first-degree murder of her sister and the conspiracy to murder her sister's husband. And she was sentenced to life, and she did not weep when they read it. She simply looked across the courtroom at me, one last time, with those cold, cornered eyes, and I looked back, and I did not look away, because I had promised Elara a witness who lived, and I intended to be one all the way to the end. I testified at Jocelyn's trial. It was the hardest day of the whole ordeal, harder than the gala, harder than the night I read Elara's letter on the study floor, because at the gala, I had the momentum of the ambush, and the letter I had alone in the dark. But the witness stand I had to face in the cold light of a courtroom, with Jocelyn 15 feet away, staring at me the entire time. The defense had one strategy left by then, having lost the ill sister story and the doctored evidence story to Elara's clean map, and the strategy was me. Their last play was to make the jury doubt the husband, to suggest that a man who had married his wife's sister and then, years later, orchestrated an elaborate public ambush and a police sting was himself unstable, obsessive, maybe even complicit. A grieving man who'd constructed a revenge fantasy and dressed it up as justice. Jocelyn's lawyer was very good, and he came at me for 3 hours, and he asked me why, if I'd loved Elara so much, I had married the very sister I now claimed I'd always suspected. He asked me why a truly innocent man would spend 11 days deceiving his own wife instead of going straight to the police. He asked me, with a curled lip, whether I had enjoyed it, the deception, the performance, whether I wasn't in fact exactly the kind of cold, calculating person I was accusing his client of being. And here is the thing I learned on that stand. The thing that let me survive it. I did not fight him. Elara had taught me, years before she died, watching her handle hostile boards, that you never win by matching a hostile questioner's heat. You win by being so completely, unbearably honest that his heat has nothing to burn. So when he asked why I married her, I said, because I was broken, and she was patient, and she had spent years making herself the person I would reach for when I broke, and it worked, and I will carry the shame of it for the rest of my life. That's not a weakness in my testimony, counselor. That's the whole crime. She's that good at being loved. Ask the jury to imagine being grieved half to death and cared for daily by the one person who seemed to understand, for a year, and then tell me who among them is so much stronger than me that they'd have seen it. And when he asked why I hadn't gone straight to the police, I said, because your client had already bought the man whose job was to protect the family, and I couldn't know who else, and I had one shot at the truth, and I was not going to waste it on a report that a bought security chief could bury the way he buried the first one. I did it the slow, careful way, with a detective who couldn't be bought and a case built to survive exactly this cross-examination, so that a good lawyer like you couldn't make it disappear. And here we are, counselor, and it hasn't disappeared. And when he asked, with that curled lip, whether I had enjoyed the deception, I looked at him for a long moment, and then I looked past him at Jocelyn, who was watching me with those cold, still eyes, and I said, quietly, no. I enjoyed exactly one moment of it, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and it was watching her own words appear on a screen 40 feet tall in front of everyone she'd ever lied to. Everything else was the worst year of my life, lived twice, once when I didn't know, and once when I did. If you think deceiving the woman who murdered my wife brought me joy, then you understand neither me nor your client, because the difference between us, the only difference that matters, is that I hated every minute of pretending, and she never felt a thing. The courtroom was silent. The lawyer had no more questions, and Jocelyn, across the room, did something she had not done once through the entire trial. She looked away first. I was in that courtroom every single day. I want you to know that. Not because I had to be, because I owed it to Elara to be the last face her sister saw whenever she turned around to find someone still watching, still remembering, still refusing to let the truth be fogged. Jocelyn had wanted, more than money, more than anything, to matter, to be seen, to not be furniture. In the end, I made sure she was seen. I saw her every day. I saw her convicted. I saw her taken away. And I have never once dreamed about her since, which is the strange gift the whole thing gave me. Because for 3 years before the message, I had dreamed about the accident every night, and after the trial, the dreams simply stopped, as if some part of me had been waiting all along, not for peace, but for the truth. And once it had the truth, it finally let me sleep. The estate was the last thing, and it was the part that mattered most, and it's the part I'm proudest of. Jocelyn had murdered for $9 billion, for the shares and the trust that were completing their transfer to me on the night she meant to drown me. Under the law, a killer cannot inherit from her victim, and everything Jocelyn had schemed toward for 4 years was stripped from her and clawed back into the estate. And the estate, at the end of the probate she'd been so desperate to control, came to me. All of it. The shares, the trust, the $9 billion, the thing 3 people had died and killed and gone to prison over. And I gave it away. Not all at once and not carelessly, because Elara would have skinned me for carelessness. But over the following year, working with Grandfather Vance, I took the fortune that my wife had been murdered for, and I built it into something that could never be inherited or stolen or killed for again. The Elara Vance Foundation. It funds public architecture, libraries, schools, housing, beautiful, useful buildings in places that are told they don't deserve beauty, dreamed up by people the world keeps in closets. The floating library was the first. There have been 11 more since, and I could tell you where each one stands because I chose the towns myself, and I chose them the way Elara would have, not the places that would look good in a press release, but the places that had been told the longest and the loudest that beauty happened elsewhere. A library in a coal town where the last mine had closed a generation ago. A library in a desert border town where the kids crossed 2 counties for a book. A library in a flooded river district that the city had written off, built on stilts this time, floating, like the first one, because I have a weakness for buildings that refuse to drown. Each one took a fight, permits and boards, and the slow grinding machinery of making a good thing real in a world that defaults to nothing. And each fight I fought in her name, and won more than I lost. And every ribbon I cut thinking about a woman who looked at a boy's drawing in a closet and said the person who dreamed this doesn't belong here. That sentence built 12 buildings. It's still building them. It will keep building them after I'm gone, because I structured the foundation so that no single person can ever inherit it, or sell it, or bleed it, so that the thing 3 people killed for can never again be a thing anyone can kill for. Only a thing that keeps quietly turning fortune into windows, and windows into kids who dream bigger than their rooms. Every one of them has her name on a bronze plaque, and every one of them is a place where some kid who doesn't belong in a closet can go and be told, by the building itself, that they were right to dream bigger than the room they were given. I kept almost nothing for myself. I didn't want it. It was never mine, and it was never really Elara's either. Not the way the foundation is hers. The money was just the thing the monsters wanted. The buildings are the thing she wanted. The floating library opened to the public a year after the gala, properly this time, not as a crime scene and a memorial and an ambush all at once, but as what it was always meant to be, a building full of light and books and people. I went on the first ordinary day it was open, not for a ceremony, just to sit in it, and I watched the town come in. Kids, mostly. Kids from a coastal town that had spent 100 years being told the beautiful things happened somewhere else, walking into a building that floated on the water like something out of a dream. And I watched their faces do the thing faces do when a place tells you, without a single word, that you're allowed to want more than you were given. There was one boy, maybe 9, in a jacket a size too big, who came in alone and stood in the middle of the great glass reading room and just turned in a slow circle, looking up, his mouth open, and I recognized him. Not his face, but the thing in him, because I had been him, in a closet with a pencil, drawing buildings I'd never be allowed to enter. I watched him find a book and fold himself into a window seat over the water and disappear into it for 3 hours, and I thought, that is what she wanted. Not a shrine, not revenge, that boy in that window. I sat in the back of Elara's library, and I watched a stranger's kid read a book over the sea, and I cried, quietly, for the first time in a long time. And they were not the old tears, the drowning ones. They were the other kind. The kind that means something is finally healed enough to be touched without breaking. Lena found me there. She sits in it too sometimes, on the hard days, and she came and sat next to me in the back without a word, and after a while she said, she'd have hated the fuss at the opening, but this, she nodded at the boy in the window, this she'd have sat and watched all day. I know, I said. She's watching it now, Lena said simply, the way you say a thing you've decided to believe because believing it makes you better. And I let it be true, because sitting in that light with that kid in that window, it felt true. And some truths you build the same way you build a library, on purpose, in a place they said it couldn't stand. We put the first bronze plaque up that week. I unveiled it myself, no press this time, just Lena and Shaw and a handful of foundation people and the librarians. And when the cloth came off and everyone read it and went quiet, I reached out and touched the back of it, the hidden place, the single letter carved where only I would ever look, and I stood there with my hand on the S, and I made her, one more time, the promise I was finally learning how to keep. Grandfather Vance lived to see the first 4 of them open. The night at the gala when he rose out of his wheelchair, I think, gave him back 2 years he wouldn't otherwise have had. Because a man with a purpose does not die as easily as a man with only grief. He and I grew close in those years, the 2 of us the only ones left who had loved both sisters, the good one all the way, and the other one before she became what she became. Near the end, he told me something I've carried ever since. He said, I spent my whole life building a fortune so my family would be safe, and my fortune is what made my family a battlefield. If I could do it again, I'd build less and love louder. Tell that to the kids in your buildings, boy. Tell them the vault is not the treasure. I was with him near the end, more than I'd been with almost anyone in those years, because the two of us fit together in our grief the way two broken pieces sometimes do, matching along the fracture. The week before he died, he called me to the mansion, to the same dim study where I'd played him the recording of Elara's voice, and he was very small in his chair now, the great old giant almost gone, but the black eyes were still sharp, and he made the nurse leave, and he took my hand in both of his, and his hands were cold and light as paper. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it from me while I can still say it, because there's no one else left who has the right to say it to you. When Elara brought you home, that architect with no money and no name, I was against it. You know that. The whole family was against it. I thought she was throwing herself away." He paused, gathering breath the way the very old do, spending it carefully. "I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong the day she died, because I watched what her death did to you, and you cannot fake what it did to you, boy. Money marries money and feels the loss like an inconvenience. You felt it like an amputation. And I thought, that old fool, you spent your whole life measuring people by what they'd inherit, and the one person who loved your granddaughter for nothing, for herself, for a drawing of a library, was the poor boy you tried to keep away." A tear went down into the deep creases of his face. "And then I watched you marry the other one, and I thought I'd been wrong twice. I thought maybe you were weak after all, maybe the grief had hollowed you, and instead you were the one who brought her down. You buried your own heart for 11 days, and you walked into the trap on purpose, and you took the thing that murdered my granddaughter apart with your bare hands, and you did it not for the money, because you gave the money away. You did it because she asked you to, and because it was right. Do you understand what you are, Caleb? You're the only person in my entire life who ever chose my family over my fortune. My blood chose the fortune. You chose us. A poor boy from a closet was the truest advance I ever made, and I never made you. You married in, and you're the only one of us worth the name." He gripped my hand as hard as his failing strength allowed. "Bury me next to her," he said. "Not next to my wife, not in the family plot with the ones who'd have sold each other for a percentage. Next to Elara. Put me next to the good one, and put a plaque on me too, a small one, and let it say only this. He learned too late that the vault was not the treasure. Promise me." I promised him. He died 4 days later in his sleep, in the night, and the nurse said his face was peaceful, and I believe her, because a man who has finally said the thing he needed to say dies lighter than a man still carrying it. He died in his sleep, which after everything felt like a mercy the universe owed him, and I stood at his grave next to Elara's, with a small plaque that said exactly what he'd asked, and I was, by then, the last one, the keeper of both of them. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I regret it. Whether I regret marrying Jocelyn, spending a year loved by my wife's murderer, the year I can never get back. And I tell them the truth, which is that I don't, because that year is the reason I was inside the house when the message came, inside the trap, close enough to spring it, and if I had done the sensible thing 3 years earlier, if I had never let grief and a patient predator lead me into that second marriage, then Jocelyn would have simply found some other lock for the vault, and Elara's murder would have stayed an accident forever, and the truth would have died in a hidden envelope behind a photograph. Sometimes the only way to catch the thing in the dark is to let it think it's caught you first. Elara knew that. She built her whole final machine on it. And I understand now that her last, hardest gift to me was not the evidence or the message or even the truth. It was the trust. She built a trap that only worked if, 3 years after her death, I was still the kind of man who would open a safe because she asked me to. Still the kind of man who would believe a message signed with a single letter. Still, underneath all the grief and even all the lies, hers. She bet her justice on the fact that I would never really stop being her husband. And she was right. Meanwhile, in a cell she will not leave, Jocelyn Vance has all the time in the world now to think about the family she wanted, the name she killed for, the daylight she traded away. She wrote me a letter once, in the 2nd year. The prison forwarded it. I did not open it for a long time, and when I finally did, it was 3 lines. "I've had a lot of time to think about your face at the gala. You loved her more dead than most men love anyone alive. I understand now that I never had a chance. Not with you, not with any of it. She beat me from inside a coffin. K." I did not write back. There was nothing to say that a bronze plaque somewhere wasn't already saying better. I hired Lena Wang the week after Jocelyn's sentencing. Not as an assistant, never again as an assistant, but as the executive director of the Elara Vance Foundation, because there was no one alive who understood what Elara would have wanted better than the woman who had kept her real calendar in a box in her closet for 3 years because she couldn't bear to throw it away. Lena cried when I offered it to her, and then she wiped her face and became, overnight, the most formidable person in that entire operation, and she runs it to this day with a ferocity that would have made Elara proud. And the two of us never talk about the year I was married to Jocelyn, because we don't need to. Because Lena understood before anyone that the marriage had been the wound and the trap in the same wound, and that I had bled on purpose. Shaw went back to his quiet, expensive business of cleaning up after other people's breaches, and he refused every dollar I tried to give him, and he says the same thing every time I try. "You'd have done it for me," he says. And anyway, watching that woman's face on that screen was payment enough for 3 lifetimes. We have dinner every week now, at the loud, ugly bar with the wall behind us, and we don't talk about Jocelyn. We talk about his terrible fantasy football team and my terrible taste in coffee. And it is the most ordinary and precious thing in my life, the friendship that walked into a murder investigation and out the other side without a scratch on it. Because some things, it turns out, are stronger than money and colder than hate. And one of them is a man who says he's all the way in and means it. The first anniversary of the gala, I did something I had put off for 3 years and then for 2 more. I finally went through Elara's private things. Not the evidence. I'd lived inside the evidence for months, but her real things. The box Lena had kept and the drawers I'd never been able to open and the phone I'd never been able to unlock. All the small human debris of a life that I had frozen the day she died, because thawing it meant admitting she was gone. I sat on the floor of the room the foundation had given me, and I opened it all, one thing at a time, and it was the hardest and best day of my life after the worst ones. There were photographs of us I'd forgotten. There were ticket stubs she'd kept, from movies, from a terrible play we'd walked out of and laughed about for years. There was a folder of my old drawings, the closet-era ones, the floating library in its earliest, crudest form, and she'd kept every single one. And on the back of one, in her handwriting, she'd written a date and 3 words, "The day I decided." And I understood she meant the day she decided to marry me, years before I ever asked, because that was Elara, always 3 moves ahead, even in love, especially in love. And at the bottom of the box, there was a letter. Not the evidence letter. A different one, older, softer, undated. The kind of letter you write and never send and keep meaning to. And it was addressed to me, and it began, "Caleb, in case I never say this enough out loud." And I am not going to tell you everything it said, because some things a man keeps. But I will tell you the last line, because the last line is the reason I am the way I am now. The reason I got up off that floor a different man than I sat down. The last line said, "If I'm ever gone, don't build me a shrine and live in it. Build something useful and live next to it. Promise me you'll be a person, not a widower. Promise me you'll actually be happy, not the performance of it. That's the only monument I want." She wrote that years before she died, before she knew anything, before Meridian and Gavin and the breaks, and she left it in a box for me to find on some far future floor. And when I read it, I finally understood what she had been trying to tell me in the evidence letter too, the line I'd skipped past in my rage. Actually be happy, not the performance of it. She'd said it twice, 3 years apart, in a box and in a trap, because she'd known me well enough to know that grief would make a shrine out of me, and that a shrine is just another kind of coffin, prettier, slower, but a coffin. So I made her the promise, out loud on the floor to a letter, and then I started, slowly, clumsily, terribly, to keep it. It took years. I want to be honest about that, because the competitor stories I studied all end with a time skip and a smiling couple and a moral. And life is not a time skip, it's the long, unglamorous work between the last dramatic scene and the smile. And I did that work. I went to a therapist, which is not a thing men like me are supposed to admit. And I sat in a beige room and I said the unsayable things about a year of being loved by a murderer and a wife who died knowing and a friend who never wavered. And it helped, slowly, the way real things help, without music, without a montage. I learned to sleep in a bed alone without listening to the house for the sound of a footstep. I learned to walk into the Vance Tower, which I kept only long enough to gut and restructure and hand to a board grandfather and I could actually trust, without feeling the frozen lake dread. I learned, hardest of all, to say Elara's name without it opening the whole wound, to let it be a warm thing again. The name of a woman I'd loved and lost and honored, instead of the name of a case I'd won. That took the longest. For a long time after the trials, her name was a trigger, not a memory, a word that snapped me straight back to the study floor and the boat and the screen 40 feet tall, and I'd flinch when a foundation staffer said it casually in a meeting. The Elara Vance Scholarship, and have to breathe through it. My therapist told me that grief that turns into a mission stops being grief and starts being armor, and that armor keeps you upright, but it also keeps you numb. and that at some point, if I ever wanted to actually feel her again instead of just avenging her, I'd have to take the armor off and let the loss be just loss, plain and soft and survivable, with no enemy attached to it. That was the last and hardest work, harder than the 11 days, harder than the stand, because it meant grieving her all over again. This time with no villain to be angry at, no trap to spring, no case to build, nothing to do with the pain but feel it and let it pass through and leave her, at the end, as what she had always really been to me. Not a victim, not a mission, not a ghost in a machine, just Elara, the woman who looked at a drawing in a closet and changed my whole life, and who I got to love for a while, and who I lost. When I could finally hold her that way, plain and warm and gone, without the armor, I knew the wound had become a scar, and a scar is a thing you can live with, a thing you can even be grateful for, because it's proof you were cut somewhere that mattered. And somewhere in the 4th year, at a foundation event, at the opening of the 6th library, in a town that had been told for 100 years it didn't deserve beautiful things, I met someone. I'm not going to make her a character in this story, because she isn't one. She's a real person, and she deserves better than to be a redemption prize at the end of a revenge tale. So I'll only say this. She's a structural engineer. She reviewed the load calculations on the 6th library and found an error the whole firm had missed and told me about it directly, bluntly, without caring who I was, and I looked at her across a table full of blueprints, and I heard, faint and far off, the ghost of Elara's laugh. Not a warning this time, something more like a blessing, and I understood that being able to notice a person again, to actually see them, was itself the proof that I had kept the promise, that I had become a person and not a widower, that the shrine had a door, and I had finally walked out of it. We took our time. We're still taking it. There's no gala, no dramatic scene, no time skip to a penthouse balcony. There's just 2 people building things, slowly, in the daylight, and it is the least cinematic and most precious thing I have ever done. And Elara, I think, wherever the good ones go, is not jealous of it. Elara is relieved. Because the last thing she ever asked me for was to stop performing and start living, and I finally did. And if there is any monument to her that matters more than the 11 buildings with her name on them, it is that. It is a man who learned, because she taught him, that the vault is not the treasure. I still have the photograph, the one from the safe, the one of Elara and me on the cliffs, the one Jocelyn walked past every day for a year without fear, the one that hid the combination that only I could read. I took it back from the house before I sold it, and it hangs now in my home, not as a shrine, just as a photograph. 2 young people on a cliff who had no idea what was coming and loved each other anyway. And sometimes, late, I'll stand in front of it, the way I stood in front of it the night I opened the safe, and I'll think about the message that came at 3 a.m. and changed everything. And I'll think about how my dead wife reached across 3 years and a grave to hand me the truth and the trap and, at the very end of it, the permission to be happy. And once, only once, on the 5th anniversary of the night the message came, I did something I'd never told anyone about until now. At exactly 3 a.m., I woke up on purpose, and I picked up my phone, and I typed a message to the number that had gone dark 5 years before, the one saved under a single letter, the S that had belonged to me and not to the company. And I knew it would never deliver, knew it was gone, knew I was typing into the void, and I typed it anyway. I wrote, I finished it, all of it. She has nothing and you have 11 libraries and I have, finally, a life. You can let go now. I did. Thank you for trusting me to be the last person to open the door. I love you. I'll always love you. But I'm going to be happy now, actually happy, not the performance of it, because you asked me to, and you never once asked me for anything you didn't mean. Goodbye, my love, E. And I hit send, into the nothing, into the dark, and the little icon spun and never delivered. Of course it never delivered. And I put the phone down and I lay back in the dark, and for the first time in 5 years, in the exact hour that had started all of it, I was not afraid, and I was not grieving, and I was not performing, and I closed my eyes, and I slept. That's the whole story. A message from a dead woman at 3 o'clock in the morning, and a murderer sleeping beside me, and 11 days, and a trap built out of trust, and a fortune given away, and a promise kept. People hear it and the focus on the twist, the sister, the boat, the gala, the moment the mask came off in front of 300 people, and I understand that. Those are the parts that make a story. But that was never the real story, not to me. The real story is a woman who loved a boy in a closet, and who was murdered for being good, and who spent the last weeks of her life making sure that even from inside a coffin, she could reach forward through the years to protect him one last time, and who used that same last reach not to demand revenge, but to give him permission to live. I got the revenge. I won't pretend I didn't want it, or that watching Jocelyn's face on that screen wasn't one of the coldest satisfactions of my life. But the revenge was mine. The mercy was hers. And in the end, 5 years on, standing in front of a photograph of two people on a cliff, it is the mercy I carry, not the revenge, because the revenge ended in a cell, and the mercy is still opening libraries in towns that were told they didn't deserve them, still telling kids in closets that they were right to dream bigger than the room they were given. Still, all these years later, doing the only thing Elara Vance ever really wanted to do with all that terrible money, which was build something beautiful and useful and put it somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. That's her. That's all of her, the whole of the woman in every one of those buildings. And every single one of them has a small bronze plaque, and every plaque says the same thing, the thing I chose myself, the thing that is the truest sentence I know. It says, for Elara, who saw the truth and trusted it to someone who would live. And under that, where only I know to look, on the back of every plaque, hidden the way she taught me to hide the things that matter, there is a single letter. S. For the name that was never the company's, for the name that was always and will always be mine. 3 years I buried my wife. 3 years I believed it was an accident. And then one night a phone lit up in the dark, and a dead woman handed me the truth. And I have spent every day since being worthy of it. Not the revenge, the trust. That's the story. That was always the story. And I am, at last, exactly what she asked me to be. I am happy. Actually happy. Not the performance of it. The end.